name that comes to mind when we think of the Jam' or the compilation or the collection of the Quran. We'll talk about these terminologies in a bit, inshallah. Until today, we call it Mushaf Uthman, right? The Mushaf of Uthman, or a Mushaf al-Imam. These are the titles of the Mushaf and the discussions of Rasm, how the orthography of the text, the discussions of qira'at and the variant readings. All of these are tied in a way to how Uthman radiallahu anh compiled, of course, the committee of Uthman, not just Uthman himself, compiled the Quran in one text. So the book is divided over these historical periods, but usually we don't really focus much on, okay, what happened before that? From the very beginning, from day one, when the Prophet ﷺ received revelation in the cave of Hira at the age of 40, we have now 23 years of constant work on disseminating the Quran. And understanding what happened during these 23 years is really crucial for us to understand, okay, then what happened during the time of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, and then what happened during the time of Uthman radiallahu anh. So we're not going to get to what happened during the time of Abu Bakr and Uthman. We'll just focus on the time of the Prophet ﷺ, as you can tell from the title of the talk, and that's also why we chose the title before the Mus'haf. It wasn't really called a Mus'haf in this sense yet. We can find reports, by the way, during that time that the Sahaba started using Mus'haf. We have a few authentic reports of that term being in circulation, but it wasn't the way we understand, of course, today. So this is one point. The second point, this topic is tricky because it's pretty easy to understand. There isn't really a lot of, it's not really complicated in a sense, but it's tricky because the data is overwhelming. The amount of data that we have, or the amount of perspectives that we can look at this topic from, really, really massive. So we are going to move from a lot of points to the other. We're going to be talking about a lot of different things. We can't cover the whole topic in one session. And by the way, that period, inshallah, will be covered in the book over 3 chapters. So it's really long, and 2 of them are extremely long chapters for the relative sizes or the relative length of books. So there's a lot of things to talk about. I just selected some topics. Some points we'll have to just go over them in brief, and some points we'll spend some time. The overall objective is to have a solid background about this discussion and to maybe answer the most important questions on the collection of the Quran, inshallah. Third point, recently, and that's my personal observation, there is really rising interest in our community regarding this topic. The topic of ulum al-Quran in general, Quranic sciences, it wasn't as, I would say, common, or it wasn't as, there wasn't really like a lot of interest in going deep into the sciences of the Quran. But again, that's my own observation. The past couple of years, there is a lot of more interest in the Quran in multiple perspectives, but specifically the perspective of the history. So there are a lot of discussions about, okay, can we revisit some of these questions? Can we rethink again how the Quran was preserved? Of course, the topic of qira'at is very common. We're not going to talk much about qira'at today, but of course, our topic is a very important prerequisite for understanding the idea of why we have different pronunciations of certain words in the Quran. How did that start, both orally and in the written Mus'haf, or the Mus'haf of Uthman, or the Mus'haf of Abu Bakr, for example. So with that, now we're facing a lot of questions. Some people are actually confused. Some people are genuinely confused because it's not something that they thought about much. We as Muslims, we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala preserved the Quran. He promised it's not going to be distorted or corrupted. Then we're fine with this. And that's a valid theological point. But when we think of history, you find, okay, it looks like the story is a little bit more complex, so we need kind of more details or more discussion about that. And this is one of the objectives, inshallah, of this seminar. The last point, since this is a long seminar, so all questions and comments are welcome anytime. Just please, by show of hands or by raising your hand, I will try to pause at kind of an appropriate point, and then we can take the question or the comment, inshallah, and then we resume. I don't want it to be just instruction or lecturing all the time. I'm going to be sharing a lot of things, but at the same time, I would love for this, inshallah, to be interactive. Any question you have, any thought, please feel free to raise your hand and interrupt me anytime. If I'm in the middle of a point, I will kindly ask you to just give me some time before I finish the point, until I finish the point, and then we can address the question, inshallah. I promise we will have a break, but I tend to forget a lot. So please remind me once you feel tired. We're gonna try to time that to be halfway through, inshallah, maybe in an hour or 15 minutes. So if you find me just like going, please feel free to interrupt me, take a break, inshallah, and freshen up, and then we continue, bi'idhnillah. Any questions or concerns so far? I know I haven't said much yet, but are we good? Okay, Bismillah. The presentation is going to be divided over the two aspects of preservation. One is the oral preservation. So we'll just focus on that, like how the Quran was orally transmitted, conveyed, memorized during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So that's basically half of the presentation. And the second half will be, okay, now we understood the oral transmission. Let's focus on how it was written and transcribed by the Sahaba. So when we get so much deep into the oral transmission, I'm avoiding talking about written transmission on purpose, but doesn't mean, of course, they are separated. We should keep that in mind, that the oral transmission movement is happening, but writing was happening in parallel as well. So we should keep that in mind, but I just split them or divided them for the sake of kind of conceptual clarity. Before the point of, or before we start talking about like oral transmission in particular, one key term is important to think about is recension. That's a term in transmission studies. It's not clear. I can't see that on my end. Are you able to? I don't have that on my end for some reason. Any chance we can dim that light? Or they're all the same? They're all the same. Okay. I think I can do that on the mic. Sure. Okay. Is it better now? I know the light is a little bit difficult to read, but I think we can't just dim that part of the room. So hopefully, inshallah. I'm going to read most of what on each slide. I also try to avoid having like a lot of the text on the slides. So inshallah, hopefully you're not gonna miss anything. So the first thing that we need to think about before we're talking about this topic in general is the concept of recension. This is an academic term that relates to transmission of text in general. So recension is a process of verification in a simple manner, meaning that we knew there was a text back in the days, let's say a few centuries ago. That text was in circulation. We didn't have clear process of editing and copying this text. And now we need to do something that academics call reconstruction of the text, right? I need to reproduce it. I need to reconstruct it. I need to find the most authentically representative form of that text possible. So what these studies do is that we're going to examine all the versions of the document that we have, and then we're going to apply several methods to identify the most reliable form of this text. This is something that happened with a lot of traditional or classical texts, by the way. So that, of course, includes religious texts, but also could include philosophy texts, for example. If we know that Aristotle has written something on politics, just a random example. And then we didn't have this book anymore. He didn't maybe publish it in the sense that we understand publication today. And then the next generation didn't really. And then the third generation, we find a lot of cross-referencing of what he was saying or what he was arguing. Now we need to reconstruct what would be the most representative text that gives us or conveys to us what Aristotle has said about this topic. So we'll have fragments, we'll have quotations, we'll have cross-referencing by Aristotle himself if we find other works for him, and we'll try to reconstruct what will be the most authentic form of what he, again, any other person, said about this topic. Luckily for us, we didn't need to do that with the Quran. This is the argument that I'm trying to make today, right? we didn't really need to make that. We didn't need to wait for centuries to say, okay, let's try to reconstruct Surah Al-Baqarah. We know there was something called Surah Al-Baqarah. People used to recite it in mosques or community teaching settings, but we lost it. We don't have it written. We don't have it really well memorized. We have fragments. So let's try to put it together and arrange what Surah Al-Baqarah would look like, or the whole Quran. We didn't, alhamdulillah, fall into this problem. And that becomes clear when we think or look at the other religious texts, specifically, of course, the Bible, or both the Old or New Testaments. If you look at the Hebrew Bible, I'm not going to focus on this. It's not really the big part of the presentation, just like a kind of a general background. When you look at the Hebrew Bible, for example, it took almost 2,000 years. 2,000 years to come to what would be a representative text on behalf of what the Hebrew Bible said. Right? So you see now like a really big discontinuity. And again, I don't really want to do the business of like, oh, we're better, we're the best, because like that's not the point, even though it's correct, but that's not really the point, right? The point is just really to examine in a, as objective as we can be, what was the difference? Because that's a religious text, and we believe in these books, right? It's part of our tenets of faith. كُلٌّ آمَنَ بِاللَّهِ وَمَلَائِكَتِهِ وَكُتُبِهِ. You have to believe in the books, in the divine books of Allah. So that's revelation. We don't have the exact form of that revelation, but it was revelation. We believe in the book, in the existence of the book. We believe in Musa, of course, alayhi salam, and the other prophets as well. And that just sentence about Hebrew Bible, by the way, it's extremely complicated story. If you're interested in comparative religion or textual studies, it really went through a very complicated process of redaction, of reconstruction, of debates, of also different kind of political upheavals that happened. A lot of other factors were involved in that process of remaking what the Hebrew Bible looked like, because the transmission was interrupted, not for a decade or two. We're talking again, a process that lasted 2,000 years. And this is not something, oh, you Muslims are saying that about them. That's just history, and this is really very well established. If you look at the New Testament, it's not a big difference. Of course, less time, but it's still talking about 3 to 4 centuries. Imagine just at the level of the language, how much change happened. Forget about any other factor, right? Forget about who had access to the text. Was it only for elite religious leadership or for everyone? Who was memorizing the text? Was it even memorized or not? That's another question, by the way. Because we believe in some of the khasa'is, some of the special characteristics of the ummah of the Prophet ﷺ is hifz, is memorization. And we'll talk a lot about this today. The previous scriptures were not actually memorized. Really, barely the Prophet and maybe a couple of disciples, but people didn't really, it wasn't an obligation for them, for example. We have some obligations in Islam about memorizing the Quran, right? That didn't exist in previous religions or previous scriptures. It wasn't something, actually, then the story of Uzair, when he reproduced a lot of what he memorized from the Bible, it was looked at to be, that's fascinating. They couldn't just process that somebody could memorize scripture. It was a very big deal. And he just like, and it wasn't 100% really accurate, but it was like we knew names of particular individuals, like couple individuals, who were able to memorize parts of the Bible. So it wasn't something that the community shared or something that the community really strived towards memorizing. So just at that level of memorization, or that level of language, how language evolves, and we know that the language that Isa alayhi salam spoke is even different, and then like you have multiple languages involved, multiple cultures involved, multiple redaction and editorial processes were involved in producing that. How accurate that will be representative of what the Bible is saying, we can, talk about that a lot. The question here is, now this Quran versus biblical traditions. Are we just saying that because we believe in it? That's really the major question today. Are we saying Quran is mahfuz and preserved just because you say so? Or just because it's a theological belief or an emotional thing? Allah says, "Inna nahnu nazzalna dhikra wa inna lahu lahafidun." We have revealed this dhikr, this reminder, the Quran, and we are its guardian, or we have promised to protect it. So maybe you Muslims are just saying that because it's a theological belief. It's not a historical argument, or it's not a rational argument. It's a theological commitment that I'm Muslim, I have to believe that the Quran is preserved because God said so. But that wasn't really the case. And this is, again, the main question we're trying to answer today. One of the early scholars in Islam, his name is Ismail ibn Muhammad. He was a Maliki judge, I think 3rd Hijri century. He was once asked, some students asked him, why Allah did not protect the Torah or the Injil or the Bible against distortion and change while the Quran is preserved. So he made a very beautiful note based on this ayah in Surah Al-Ma'idah. إِنَّا أَنزَلْنَا التَّوْرَاةَ فِيهَا هُدًى وَنُورٌ. We have revealed the Torah with guidance and light. Again, it's a revealed book from Allah. يَحْكُمُ بِهَا النَّبِيُّونَ الَّذِينَ أَسْلَمُوا لِلَّذِينَ هَادُوا. The prophets who had submitted to God judged according to the Torah for the Jews. لِلَّذِينَ هَادُوا, meaning for the Jews. So did the rabbis and the scholars in accordance with that part of God's scripture. Then I want you to focus on the next phrase, which they were entrusted to preserve. بِمَا اسْتُحْفِظُوا مِنْ كِتَابِ اللَّهِ. He made that very deep reflection saying that Allah gave them that job, but He didn't support them in this job. That's also a little bit of a theological point, by the way. So I know I'm saying we're not just talking about theology, but that's a kind of a, maybe theology is not the right word, but it's not just a faith commitment, even though what Imam Ismail is saying is a kind of a faith commitment that when Allah leave it up to you or leave you on your own, preserving the book, they couldn't do it. He said, when Allah spoke about the Torah in the Quran, He said, بِمَا اسْتُحْفِظُوا. They were entrusted with the job, they couldn't do it. That's the meaning. But for the Quran, He said, you should memorize it, you should preserve it, but I'm going to protect it as well. So there is a kind of a divine promise, إِنَّا نَحْنُ نَزَّلْنَا الذِّكْرَ وَإِنَّا لَهُ لَحَافِظُونَ, in addition to the effort, the extensive effort that Nabi alayhi salatu wasalam and the Sahaba did during his life and afterwards. So now we start with the oral transmission. Let's focus on the idea of orality or transmission of the Quran in an oral sense. And again, that's the first part, and then we'll move to the written transmission, inshallah. Today, people are confused a lot about orality. We don't think orality is actually reliable. We believe that anything that is just said verbally doesn't really have a lot of value. It doesn't really have, we can't be confident in something to be accurate if it was just transmitted by people. Is that a bias, or you think this is objectively true? Believing that orality does not, what I mean by orality is just like narrating things verbally. Do you think this is objectively weak or inferior when it comes to the preservation of any statement? So what are the positive aspects? Like examples?
So the positive aspect is there's some sort of elements that can create some sort of one generation to another.
Mm-hmm.
That transmissions can be
Mm-hmm.
And the negative part about it, they could be distorted, added to something. Speaking general.
Yeah. So I think your answer is it's not necessarily unreliable, or it's not objectively unreliable. Yes, yes.
It's has been transmitted from education to education through oral.
Okay.
Like المتن or قراءة ورش or حفص, they came through Shiekh عن فلان عن فلان عن فلان until it goes like 16, 20 people, and then they started to comment or to write it down.
Okay, so I think my additional layer of the question is, are we saying that because we're Muslims?
Because it was proven by history.
It was proven by history. So that's exactly my question, which is, and I know you answered the question, but just making the point that the being immersed in modern, certain understandings of knowledge, literacy, I'll talk about literacy a lot today, inshallah, production of knowledge, transmission of knowledge, preservation of knowledge. Of course, everybody is like ibn waqtihi, like we are like the people of this time. We're going to be influenced by a lot of conceptions. The problem becomes, or happens, when we universalize our conception. Like, it has always been like that. No, that's the point of history, is to always bug you until you know it hasn't. That's really what history does to us. Like, oh, people have always like, no. Sometimes we really get so immersed into, I'm talking across the board, it's not just about this. I feel like, yeah, the whole world has been doing that. It's like 50 years ago, it was a very different kind of situation. And maybe 50 years from now will be also a very different situation. People change, people evolve, people, like, it's a lot of factors, extreme, complex sets of factors affect a lot of these things. So if you look in history, a lot of civilizations, if not, you can arguably say most civilizations relied extensively on oral transmission. Writing wasn't actually writing wasn't prestigious. That's the funny part. It wasn't actually prestigious. The oral transmission was the prestige for. I'm not just talking about Islam and Hadith, by the way, Quran, just across the board. When you study literary sources across different languages and cultures and civilizations, oral transmission was the main thing. Writing is secondary for the most part. People didn't really rely on writing that much, and we'll talk about how Arabs wrote today, inshallah, and like how the Arabs preserved poetry. Yeah, we know that the 7 odes were written on sheets and were hanging in the Kaaba, the mu'allaqat, that happened, but like most poetry was not. And they memorized it with extreme level of accuracy. And by the way, we have the riwayat and variants in poetry like we have in the Quran. Of course, Quran is more kind of higher level of accuracy, but we have like when you memorize poetry, it's like, okay, there's riwayat fulan, based on which riwayat, you will find variants in what Imru al-Qais said or what Mutanabbi said or any other person. There is transmission system for poetry that has been there for so long. The Arabs preserved the cultural norms in poetry, preserved history in poetry or prose sometimes. That war happened, and then that person wrote that poem to document what happened in that war. That's their method of documentation. Nobody really thought much about writing that. But we might say, yeah, because they didn't know how to write. That's the big problem now. That's something that I would like to challenge today. I hope we're not going to have a very narrow definition or conception of what literacy means. Because usually what happens is we conflate literacy with education. So when we say literate, illiterate, literate, unliterate, and we'll talk about translations of the Quran using these words about the Quran as well, right? About certain words in the Quran. When we say the Arabs were illiterate, what does that mean? Means they didn't go to college? Or means they didn't write down, they didn't know how to write down, or they knew but they chose not to? Like, what we need to define that. If you use in today's conception of literacy, that's known across the board to be, of course, anachronistic view of history, which is very rejected, because like you can't just like project back 15 centuries ago in completely different context, right? So if you think, yeah, Nabi ﷺ kana ummi, and I have one full slide on the idea of ummi because it's very crucial to this topic. What does ummi mean? Now, you open Quran translations, you find different words, one of which will be unlettered. Some people say illiterate and they say it's a little bit offensive maybe for us, offensive. So let's avoid the use of the word illiterate and use unlettered. Or let's use a whole phrase saying he didn't know how to read or write. Yeah, but what does that mean? Because he said, Ana afsahun nas. He said publicly, the Prophet ﷺ wouldn't be a person we would assume that he is, self-praising himself, right? But he said simply, I'm the most eloquent person on earth. He said that nas, like people. He didn't say like tribe or family or Muslims. Ana afsahun nas. I'm the most eloquent person. So if we understand ummi to be he didn't know how to read or write, then what does that mean? Like what gave more prestige to people at that time? Did people mock him for being ummi? We don't find that in the seerah. Did people say, like, oh, he didn't know how to read or write, so why are you saying you're a prophet? It wasn't really a big thing for people to say. You might say, yeah, because all of them were. Like, no, they weren't. We have a lot of writings that actually happened at that time. So there's a common conception that people in the Arabia didn't know how to read or write. That's wrong. Let's just assume, just take my word for this for now, and I will hopefully convince you a little bit later that that's not really accurate depiction of what people in the Arabian 7th century did. That's one. And two, again, when we say literate, illiterate, and these terms, you have to be very careful about projecting the meanings of these words on historical, on very different historical contexts. So when you think of that time, 7th century Arabia, during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, again, number one, the idea of literacy was conceived differently. Number two, the idea of knowledge and ilm was publicly accessible. That's something beautiful about Islam. The Prophet ﷺ didn't say, okay, Quran, I'm going to choose Abu Bakr and Umar and few Sahaba. You're going to be the guardians of Quran. You're going to receive the Quran. No one else will. And then people can ask you. The idea of the disciples in that strict sense didn't exist. From day one, he's asked to, how many times the Quran says utlu, recite? A lot of times, right? Sometimes utlu, and then it tells them utlu what? Like recite what? Sometimes we'll identify what he needs to recite, to whom he needs to recite. Sometimes it doesn't. Just utlu alayhim. Just utlu ma uhiya ilayk. Recite whatever is revealed to you. You have different variations of how the command of recite is given to the Prophet ﷺ. And the beautiful thing about this term of recite is that it denotes linguistically an interactive process. There are people involved here. He's not sending us a message. He's not just like writing it down, speaking of writing, and then handing it over to people, or he kept it just like heading somewhere, and then after he passed away, people said, okay, let's look for any document that had the Quran. From day one, command is clear from Allah. You need to preach the message as wide and as far as you can. The idea of propagating the message was something from the very beginning. From the Makki Quran, he's commanded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to do that. I think the idea of isnad emerged from very early on, because now the Sahaba are learning firsthand, and then they're teaching each other, and then they're teaching their students, and then the isnad until today, alhamdulillah, has never been broken. The idea of ijaza, that some of you or a lot of you maybe are in Quran classes or Quran settings, teaching settings, they will get an ijaza. Why ijaza is something we take it very seriously? Because it keeps the continuity of that chain of transmission, has never been broken in history. It has been there since the time of the Prophet ﷺ until today. And of course, it became a very rigorous mechanism of transmission, because you have ijaza and you have conditions and qualifications of the teacher, of the process, of the student, of a lot of these things. And then ijaza of reading the whole Quran. And then the person has to read from memory if they read from the Mus'haf. I know that's controversy in certain communities, so I'm not going to get to that point now. But generally, that wasn't something that was accepted, to get an ijaza just by reading. Of course, if you want to concede this is okay, you have to document that. If your sheikh gives you ijaza by reading from the Mus'haf, they will have to mention that in the ijaza, right? Because everything has to be very well identified and specified. If you involve the hadith transmission studies and the exhaustive efforts they put into checking the reliability of each transmitter, the historical facts of did these people meet or not? Did these people talk to each other or not? Is it possible that Sahabi met that Sahabi and heard that from? So you have a lot of these cumulative efforts of ensuring that the idea of isnad and transmission has never been interrupted. Again, compare that with previous scriptures. It is not something that was common. A lot of the statements from the early Salaf that they would say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala honored this ummah by this distinction that he didn't honor previous ummahs about the transmission in this way. We have a hadith from about Musa alayhi salam, that he was talking to Allah and he was showing his fascination with the fact that he knew from the Bible that there will be community after him. So he was giving prediction about the community of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. And see what's the main thing that attracted his attention, alayhi salam, Sayyidina Musa. The main thing that attracted his attention, he was surprised. He said, رَأَيْتُ قَوْمًا, like I've seen in the Bible about these people, I've read about these people, أَنَاجِيلُهُمْ فِي صُدُورِهِمْ. Their Bibles, he used the word of his scripture, meaning the Quran, their Bible is in their heart. That was something interesting for Musa alayhi salam. For us, maybe like, okay, sure, a lot of us we try, and a lot of Muslims memorize the Quran. It wasn't really common. It wasn't common in religious scriptural experiences. So for Sayyidina Musa to bring that up when he is talking with Allah, it's a very big deal that he is very surprised that one day people will just like memorize the scripture. Another thing, the Quran was made as, you can say, prayer book. Every Muslim needs to connect with it at least for salah. So tying the Quran to salah, which is the most fundamental act in Islam, will have to preserve, to some extent at least, the text itself. If we know that if you didn't recite al-Fatiha, your salah is invalid, but everybody has to recite al-Fatiha. That's partial preservation of part of the text. And then everybody is highly commanded to recite something from the Quran after Fatiha. So every Muslim has some Quran memorized. This is collective process of preservation as well. We will talk a little bit later about Taraweeh. Taraweeh was a beautiful mechanism of preserving the Quran. From the time it was regulated by Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu, and the way he institutionalized Taraweeh and appoint imams and portions of the Quran, like he had a whole kind of system of Taraweeh, that contributed a lot. And that was before Uthman did the compilation. So we're talking very early, the final compilation. So that was a very important contribution to now the whole community is nightly, at least at Ramadan, reciting large portions of the Quran. Hundreds of people are reciting and memorizing or correcting, right? And they have some copies written at that time as well. So Taraweeh was a very crucial, we tend to forget about that link between Taraweeh and the preservation of the Quran. It was actually one of the very important factors that helped keep the Quran preserved. And then finally, these are general factors about the distinctive oral culture of the Muslim Ummah, is the Arabs and the Sahaba memorized a lot of poetry. as I mentioned earlier. Poetry was like the lifeblood for the Arabs. It's a very important, very crucial, very honorable thing to be a poet or to memorize poetry. Like they teach kids to memorize poetry. When the Quran came, we know that people were fascinated by the eloquence of the Quran. So they started basically being distracted by the language of the Quran. And I wouldn't say they neglected poetry, but we can actually observe that the production of poetry went down a lot during the early decades of Islam. So if you trace the history of poetry in Arabic poetry, before Islam, very high, like production-wise. During the first few decades, actually went down, and then it went up again. Right? People who study do literary studies, poetry, pre-Islamic Jahili poetry, a lot. Islamic era, a little bit early on, and then Umayyads going up, then Abbasi going up, and you have like massive different kind of genres of poetry as well. One of the reasons is people were just like fascinated, and maybe some of them were confused about the Quran. Confused in a good sense. There's like, wow, like we couldn't realize, even the greatest of poets, that there is a text that can reach that level of eloquence. You know, Zuhair, one of the great poets, he was very old, but he embraced Islam towards the end of his life. And then Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu used to appreciate poetry a lot. When he was the Khalifa, he met with him and he said, why don't you write something, or did you write something recently? Just, you meet with a famous celebrity and you say like, okay, what's your most recent kind of poem or something? So his response was intriguing because he said, I'm busy with Al-Baqarah and Ali Imran. Like my mind is very just like, I'm very immersed into just appreciating that. That's a new Muslim. That's basically a new convert, and he's saying, I basically can't. Not literally, because he can. He's actually one of the greatest poets at that time. But he's saying, I'm just trying to process how different rhetorical forms can develop in that sense, but in the same language that we use. And that's why that's a different topic. But the topic of i'jaz, of the miracle of the Quran, is beautiful because it confused people, because it's the same language you use, right? The Quran didn't bring different language. Quran actually used poetic images that people already are using. There are poetic images in the Quran that you find tafsir scholars saying Imru al-Qais was the first person to use that before the Quran. Like he was one of the first people to describe the beauty of women in this particular way. The Quran used the same style. And it's telling people, you're familiar with that. You memorize this poetry. The Quran will use the same thing, but it will hit differently. And that's why they became very intrigued by the power of the Quranic rhetoric. And the Quran kept pushing them to believe, because the Quran sometimes would tell them, Alif Lam Mim. What does that mean? You know, when somebody is not able to understand a basic concept and they say, hey, I'm speaking to you in English. I don't know how else I can explain to you. That's one of the meanings. Alif Lam Mim, it's letters. It's the same language you use, the same, the most discrete units of the sentences you use in your daily life. It's a lisan Arabiy mubin. It's a clear Arabic. It's not something really difficult. They couldn't process that. Some people, of course, submitted and believed. Some people, they couldn't, and simply that's why they went to war. Scholars of I'jaz said, if they could produce something like the Quran, why would they go to war? It was a simple challenge. Bring back the Quran, prove that he's just making stuff up, move on, right? No, they said like, no, we're not going to do that. This is the challenge. We didn't challenge you to go to war. We challenge you to produce a text like this. Like, no, we're going to fight. That means you can't produce something like it. So that's the whole point of the mu'jiza, or the miracle of the Quran. Now that's the culture. Looking at the Quran itself, how the Quran kind of refers to itself in the Quran, right? Quran calls itself Quran, obviously, right? But it also calls itself Kitab. Kitab, for anybody who like just any Arabic speaking person listens to this word, that means sheets or papers, right? Or simply something written down. So the fact that the Quran from early on, we have Makki Quran that uses terms like kitab. That's an indication to the Prophet ﷺ and the community that will be written down. This has to be written down. You can make the argument too. Like if the Quran keeps describing itself with the word kitab, then it's going to be written down. And the Quran uses qalam, pen, right? Uses the idea of sheets, sometimes lawh, tablets, all these words. So the Quran uses words of written forms, uses tools of writing in the language. If people had no idea about writing, or if people didn't really think about writing down the Quran, why is the Quran telling them that? And we assuming the Quran is relevant, because like otherwise people would have pointed that out. Like, why are you talking about things that are extremely irrelevant to us? No, it's relevant. It's using things that people are very familiar with. So calling itself Quran, calling itself a kitab, that affirms the dual modes of preservation, that this will eventually happen in preserving the Quran. And then the final kind of standardization of the Quran during the time of Uthman radiallahu anhu, that happens within decades after the passing of the Prophet ﷺ. And again, there was no really interruption in that. A lot of people today think that, okay, all of that is history. History is not objective. History is not very accurate. We can always be wrong. Fine. That's not right, but fine. Do we have material evidence? And that's something that in academic circles and beyond, people are very interested in material evidence. Give me material evidence that the Quran is like an early text. By the way, in the earlier academic circles, like modern academic circles, and Western, some people, it was strong actually kind of opinion that a lot of people held, that the Quran is not a 7th century text. The Quran actually came into that final form 2 centuries later. So it was during the Abbasid era when the Quran was formed. That was a kind of opinion held by very serious Western scholars. Now this is laughable. Nobody says that anymore. Why? Because we found material evidence. And people are opposing orality. We're like, okay, orality is not really relevant. We use orality to be anecdotal. Some of them, I'm not saying all Western scholars do that, but say like orality, fine, it's nice. We can read the Tabari and the early books of Sirah and history to get some glimpses of the culture, but we're not going to take that too seriously. We need material evidence. So by the time they started finding manuscripts, like, oh, and then now we have a lot of technology. You can do carbon dating of a lot of these manuscripts. And you're like, oh, that's actually earlier than we thought. Not just carbon dating, by the way. Now you can uncover the underlying text if it has been erased. I don't know if you saw that before. If you have a manuscript that has been erased, so people didn't have a lot of money. Papers were very expensive. That's why Quran early on wasn't written on papers. Papers extremely expensive. Papers were known at that time through China, but it was known already in 7th century. But like, how many people have papers at home? You can't. It's really expensive. So you would use skin, animal skin, bones, leaves, all of that. So if you have a sheet of manuscript that people would do, what even students of knowledge go to the Shiekh, write down something, I'm good with it, I memorize, understand, I'm going to erase it and then write something new. So now multiple layers of the erased content, you can uncover that through certain technologies. And I think you mentioned the Sana'a palimpsest is a famous story of the Sana'a Masjid in Yemen. The whole project started by Western scholars, by the way, German and American. I think the first time they knew about it was in the 70s, and then the project took so long. There are a lot of publications on that and images that you can also watch, or you can see. It's funny because they were demolishing the mosque, and then like that when they're demolishing one wall, they found manuscripts hidden in the wall. It's like, okay, that's nice. Let's see what that is. And they started checking. They found some of the very, very early manuscripts of the Quran. So that a lot of studies were produced on that in English and also in Arabic as well. Doing that, and that was early. That's not the only one, and I'm sure you hear like the UK manuscript, the Birmingham manuscript. There are a lot of different manuscripts. Now we have a large number of manuscripts that go back to the 1st century Hijri, meaning 7th century CE, and also 8th century, very early ones. Like, okay, so now the idea of the Quran as a later text is just ridiculous, because we have material evidence. Like, we can scientifically know that that was in circulation. People wrote that down, and it matches with very high level of accuracy what we have in the Quran. Not just that, by the way. So that's like the first kind of general belief or the general conclusion. The more specific conclusion is that, okay, they started doing examination of the variance between these manuscripts. And they found remarkable consistency. It's not about the content. The remarkable consistency, we have differences, we have variance, that's fine, because we have qira'at. And we have qira'at shadda, we have non-canonical qira'at, like I'm trying to look for another word, but qira'at that are not considered to be the official Quran, basically. It could be other things, that's a different topic. So the idea of variance is there in the tradition, it's not something new. So they found variance between the manuscripts, but when they do, and some of them did that through some scientific quantitative studies, they all go back. People who do like ancestral genealogical studies of like races, for example, you can do that with texts, right? So you can examine with numbers the number of variants, and then the correlations between these variants across a number of manuscripts, and then that will give you some conclusions about, do they all go back to some kind of original text or not? Now, the common word across a lot of people in this field, again, I'm talking about like Western academia, I'm not talking about necessarily, some of them are Muslim scholars, but like that's the common Western academic discourse now, is that all of these go back to an original text. Almost no doubt about that. And that original text can be limited to maximum of 4 copies. And now we know that, oh, Uthman, we know from tradition that Uthman sent copies to the different regions. We have the copy in Asham, we have a copy in Basra and Kufa. There's ikhtilaf how many copies, but like let's say 5 to 7. So the idea that now scientifically we can know that, okay, it goes back to original text, and that text was between 4 copies, and then there are variants that can be studied and examined to be what? To be not something that was by coincidence. Even the variants were placed for a reason. And then now there are a lot of studies. What are these reasons? I will show you some examples, inshallah. So the idea of 4 ancestral codices, codice is the academic term from Mus'haf, it really aligns very closely with the story of Uthmanic canonization. I'm not saying we have 100% alignment between the traditional account and Western academy. I'm not saying that. There are some ikhtilafat, there are some disagreements, but if you trace what happened in the Western academy, and that's not really my interest today, you find it's coming closer and closer to match what the traditional account is saying. And just like a side point, you know why that happened? Because when they first started studying the Quran, they studied the Quran within the biblical studies. The whole field of Quranic studies in Western Academy is studied within biblical studies and religious studies programs. Even until today, if you do religious studies PhD, for example, in whatever American university, and you want to study that, the main approach is biblical studies. So they applied these methods to a lot of religious texts, and it's like, okay, now let's apply it to the Quran. The Quran is a book that emerged early on. Let's see when it emerged. Let's see what are the factors that developed it. The idea of authorship is just like a kind of very big obsession for Western scholars. We need to know who is the author. That's a big philosophical question. Who is the author? Is there an author, and who is the author, and all of that? So they applied the same methods they did with the Bible, for example, to the Quran. They came to some wrong conclusions that, of course, do not match what the Islamic tradition says. And then now with technology, material evidence, and all of that, you come in closer to what the traditional narrative is saying. That's not to say I told you so. Again, it is what it is. But really, this is what the academic studies have been doing now. The bottom line is, Quran is a 7th century text. Nobody really can dispute this. In whatever approach or academic orientation you can adopt. Now we spoke about the idea of literacy, and literacy is not really how we think of education. It's pretty different, and I gave some examples for that, and I hope it's clear enough. And we'll find other examples as we move forward, inshallah. We also spoke about writing not being necessarily the most important element of preservation. A lot of ancient civilizations relied primarily in their education on an oral transmissions. Even the most foundational figures in history, philosophers or poets or leaders, orality and oral transmission was very important. So the idea of us today, reality equals inauthenticity, that's of course something that needs to be rethought. There are a lot of modern studies on orality from just a general sense, not necessarily with regards to the Quran. And something interesting about these studies is their examination of how oral communication happens in oral cultures. And they have these 2 terms that are very interesting about what makes transmission reliable. You said there are 2 main mechanisms for that. One of them is called mnemonic design. And the meaning is the text will be designed in a way that facilitates memorization. So we're going to use a lot of rhyming, or like certain rhythms that connect with people. The text will use meters, like poetry sometimes, or repetition. And I want you, when you're reading these examples, again, the author was writing that, not talking about the Quran, didn't have really the Quran in mind. So I want you as you're reading or listen to this, I want you to develop and identify parallels about the Quran as I'm saying this. You see rhythm, okay, that makes sense. You see meter, makes sense. Quran is not poetry, but it had meters. I mean, certain verses were had kind of poetic meters style. Repetition, we know it's a very common thing in the Quran. Parallelism, of course, Jannah, Nar, Thawab, Iqab, like all these concepts, the parallelism between concepts or between words in a rhetorical sense. Proverbs, Amthal al-Quran, Aqsam al-Quran, when the Quran takes an oath, all these different rhetorical styles, pattern structures, extremely common in the Quran. And actually, scholars of psychology as well spoke a lot about psychodynamics of oral thought. That's a whole other subfield for this, that how a text can be developed in a way that people can not just relate to, but can easily circulate. Again, he wasn't talking, his name is Walter Ong. He had a beautiful book about, it's called Orality. So he was talking about like how oral cultures are circulating and preserving what they're communicating. So that's one way. The text will be designed in a way that will facilitate that. The second mechanism, he's talking about using familiar elements from the environment itself that basically invoke the idea in the audience. I already gave some examples earlier about the Quran using poetic images familiar to people, or using words that people knew. I know the Quran is introducing another layer of the meaning, but people already knew the word. Again, we don't have any accusation against the Prophet ﷺ, like recorded in history, that, oh, I've never heard of this style before. Again, they didn't take the challenge route because of that. فَأْتُوا بِسُورَةٍ مِّن مِثْلِهِ. They started from the whole thing, and then 10 chapters, and then 1 chapter, and then the shortest chapter, just to bring 3 verse or so chapter like the Quran. They couldn't. It's like, no, we would rather fight, but we're not gonna do that. So it's talking about something extremely relevant and something important. The Quran uses tangible imagery a lot. It's not a philosophical text per se. It's not going to use extremely abstract language that will be very complicated for people to relate to. Even when the Quran intends to deliver or to make what we would call a philosophical point, it will give you a simple example. That's why the idea of mathal in the Quran, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about himself to يَضْرِبُ الْأَمْثَالِ كَذَلِكَ يَضْرِبُ اللَّهُ. Allah sets examples for you. A lot of these examples, as you can tell, are tangible. Even about the unseen, that's the beauty of the Quran, right? You know, when one of the stories about the emergence of the ilm of balagha, the science of rhetoric, of Arabic rhetoric, or specific topics of Arabic rhetoric, they say that one person came to a scholar of language, Arabic language, and he asked him that how come the Quran uses a word that is completely foreign to us and we don't understand? Not just a word, a poetic image. And then he said, and what is that? He said, Allah speaks about Jahannam, and he says, طَلْعُهَا كَأَنَّهُ رُؤُوسُ الشَّيَاطِينِ. Speaking about a specific tree in the hellfire, and the ayah says, the fruits or the branches of that tree is like the heads of the devils. It's like, we didn't see the heads of the devils before. So what does that mean? And that triggered that scholar to establish a whole theory of metaphor in the Quran. And it's like, the first thing any scholar would do, let me see what Arabs do in literary styles. It's like, okay, the Arabs actually have multiple amthal and examples of things that never existed. The Arabs had fictional figures to make certain points. Al-ghul, wal-anqa. These are words like they didn't have extra mental reality. Just like it's an image that people think about to depict an ugly image or to depict a beautiful image. So he said this is exactly what the Quran is doing here. And then now all these terminologies of majaz and figurative language and isti'ara and kinaya, people who study rhetoric, all these different rhetorical devices, came from that idea. Because the Quran will not just talk about the hellfire in abstract language. What's the point? You need to impact the audience. You need the audience to be scared from the hellfire. You need to give them examples of things that relates to their surroundings or to their environment. And that's also another subfield that was developed for that. It's called mutual cognitive environment. That's one way that will really help people get the point, 1. 2, it's going to be engraved in their minds. So I want you to think of all these, again, that's a kind of a whole theory. But think of these 2 mechanisms of transmission, and then think of this ayah. وَلَقَدْ يَسَّرْنَا الْقُرْآنَ لِلذِّكْرِ فَهَلْ مِن مُدَّكِرٍ. We have certainly made the Quran easy for remembrance. I know some people say Surah Yunus is difficult. I've been trying to memorize it for months and it's difficult. And you know, every hafid has its like their own kind of very difficult part of the Quran. But in general, a lot of parts of the Quran are not actually difficult to memorize. I'm talking about like average level or kind of faculty of memorization in every average person, it's not too difficult to memorize. Not necessarily the whole book, but a good, sizable portion of the text. So Allah is saying in the Quran, we have made it easy for you to memorize because it's a large text. So if the Muslims are expected to memorize, then part of the divine wisdom was to make it easy. Then see the rest of the ayah. فَهَلْ مِن مُدَّكِرٍ. And mudakkir morphologically, there are actually letters that are being merged here because there's dal and ta that were there initially. So the idea has to do with, one tafsir at least, with tadhakkur, meaning remembering. And the question here is rhetorical, that so who is going to memorize? That's the point. I made it easy for you. So who is going to take the initiative and rush or take the command from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to memorize the Quran? And it's of course a rhetorical question, not a literal question. Now when we think of the text, so now we have a full text. It's designed to be easy to memorize, and I hope now you're keeping you're getting the sequence of the argument. Any text has a life cycle. Any text, again, we're talking Quran or otherwise. The first of it is composition. That's the first kind of phase of the cycle. And then you have display, needs to be displayed. And then you have storage, need to be stored somehow. And then it gets redisplayed over time. So composition, display, storage, redisplay. This is a life cycle. You can put it in a kind of a circle to be a life cycle of any text. Composition, it doesn't have to be written. Composition can also be oral and something that happens also mentally, but it also happens in writing as well. And once the text is being displayed, that means we're passing the composition level. And then you need storage because you need a reference point. And that triggers the idea of why the Sahaba rushed to put the Quran in one text. Umar ibn Khattab goes to Abu Bakr as-Siddiq and he says, Qurra are dying. They're being killed in the battles. We need to put the Quran in one text, in one written form. Why? There were other Qurra, right? Some people say, oh, it looks like they were just about to lose the Quran. No, because if you read the sentence that Umar ibn Khattab said, actually, he didn't just say Qurra are dying, which happened in the Battle of UMMA. Average, the estimation was about 40 companions known to be the Qurra reciters were killed in the Battle of Yamama. That was a couple of years after the passing of the Prophet ﷺ. So he went to Abu Bakr and said, like, we need to do something. We need to preserve the Quran. Some people say, yeah, because he's worried it was about to be lost. No, because what he said, أخشى أن يستحر القتل بالقراء. He said, I'm concerned that killing will take a lot more Qurra. Meaning what? We still have a lot of Qurra. Right? There are actually a lot of people misunderstood that statement to be, okay, Qurra were about, like, there was no more Qurra. No, he's saying we have a lot more, but we need to protect that. Meaning, let's also rely on written form of the Quran. In addition to the Quran, we're going to continue to teach the Quran. It's not something that will stop. So he said, we need a reference point. They compiled it in one text. It wasn't meant for public kind of dissemination. They kept the text with Hafsa, the Prophet's wife, radiallahu anha, and the daughter of Umar ibn Khattab. It wasn't meant to be different from what Uthman did. Let's make copies. Let's now make this the official formal codex for every Muslim across the globe. Or just like, okay, let's have a reference point, put it in writing, but community goes on with their regular Quranic teaching and memorization. So the idea of storage, this is what it means in the history of the Quran, and then redisplay. It's going the process of preservation and recitation will also continue to happen. Now the Prophet ﷺ received the Quran. Quran uses a beautiful word of talaqi. وَإِنَّكَ لَتُلَقَّى الْقُرْآنِ. It's telling him that you receive the Quran min ladun hakimin alim, from the Allah, the wise and the knowing. Then another ayah in Surah Al-Qiyamah, Allah tells him, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, لا تحرك به لسانك لتعجل به. That's a very interesting ayah. Do not rush your tongue in an attempt to hasten with the memorization of it. The ayah doesn't use memorization, but this is the meaning. And this is one of the ayat in which Allah assured him that, don't worry, إِنَّ عَلَيْنَا جَمْعَهُ وَقُرْآنَ. The Quran used the word jam'a too, which we use to say collection or compilation. It's upon us to collect the Quran, and if you take the word literally, وَقُرْآنَهُ, so the word Quran. It's upon us, the collection and the Quran. What does the Quran? The Quran of the Quran, if you want to translate literally. Because one of the meanings of Quran is qira'ah. So it's upon us both the collection and the recitation of the text. Upon us meaning upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There is a story behind this ayah. So the Prophet ﷺ, from day one, he knew that he's responsible for this. He was very worried, as Sadiq al-Amin ﷺ is entrusted with this, and it's divine responsibility. It's not something easy. He knew that I have to take this from Jibreel and give it to everybody else. He's the medium here between divine and people. So when Jibreel used to come to the Prophet ﷺ, I want you to imagine this, he's sitting and listening from Jibreel, and before Jibreel finishes reading that portion, he is trying to read with him, even though that's the first time he's receiving this. So that's why the Surah told him, do not do that. لا تحرك به لسانك. Do not move your tongue. Like, wait, just like, don't worry about it. Just because Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Abbas narrated that story. He said, كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يعالج من التنزيل شدة. He used to suffer a great deal with the revelation of the Quran. And then he said, when Jibreel used to come to him, he used to move his tongue trying, because I don't want to miss anything. He's very worried. I don't want to miss a word from the Quran. It's my responsibility, because Allah said, you have to do tabligh. You have to convey this to people. Until the ayah came, Allah told him, do not do this. لا تحرك به لسانك. Do not move your tongue. لتعجل به. To hasten with memorization. إن علينا. It's upon us جمعه. Some scholars said, it's upon us the collection of it in your heart. So don't worry about memorization. وقرآنه and recitation. You will perfect both the memorization and the recitation of the Quran. فإذا قرأناه فاتبع قرآنه. So when we recite it, meaning when Jibreel recites it to you, just follow his recitation after he's done. And since he received the ayah, he stopped doing this, alayhi salatu wasalam. He would wait. He's very calm now with divine assurance. He's very calm now. He's very quiet, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Jibreel is done, and now he repeats after Jibreel alayhi salam what he recites. What also helped the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam is the idea of graduality of the Quran. وَقُرْآنًا فَرَقْنَاهُ. Faraqnahu here in Surah Al-Isra means we divided it into portions, into like distinctive portions. In over 23 years, it wasn't like this is Surah Al-Baqarah all at once. No, that would have been challenging for maybe both the Prophet ﷺ, aside from the divine promise, and people as well. It took time for a surah like Al-Baqarah or other chapters in the Quran to be given to the Prophet ﷺ. So the idea of the gradually revealed text is something the Quran emphasizes a lot, that it was over time. لِتَقْرَأَهُ عَلَى النَّاسِ عَلَى مُكْثٍ. We gave it to you over portions, so you can read it to people slowly and comfortably, and people can internalize what you're saying. So it's a process, an interactive process between the Quran and the community of the Prophet ﷺ. The Quran resisted a concept of a text, because the way people previous scriptures, the way a text means is it's a one thing, it's a one-time thing. You know, that's why the Quraysh asked the Prophet that question, right? One thing that they were confused about, what is that text that keeps coming over time? So they said, لولا نزل عليه القرآن جملة واحدة. Why doesn't he receive his Quran at once? Why a text takes 23 years? That's something the Quran made a point that this is new, that's a different style. This is not the conventional meaning of what a text is. It's actually something that the Quran resisted for, and I'm talking religious texts like divine books of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Quran called itself kitab, but I'm not like any other kitab. Because once you hear kitab, okay, fine, it's a one-time thing. No. Okay, over a couple times, no. 23 years. Not in the same order. Not even the same order we have today. Right? The order of the Mus'haf, doesn't match the order of the revelation to the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. It's going to take a different process of being compiled to this day. Why didn't it call it something else? No, it's a kitab, but it's a different style. It's unique in all aspects. Imam al-Jahid rahimahullah said Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala named his book or gave his book different names for its entirety and for its parts that differ from any other definition that people knew at that time. Meaning, he called it Quran, but people would call it Diwan. If you have a collection of poems, you call it Diwan. They didn't call it Diwan, called it Quran. They used to call it Qasida, a poem, called it Surah. It's a new word. I mean, they knew what it means, but like nobody used it to talk about a poem. They said Bayt Shi'r, a poetic verse. We called it Ayah. So even at the most discrete unit of the Quran, even at the level of names, it needs to be unique. It's a different text that doesn't resemble any other thing that people are familiar with. So they came and asked that question, both the pagans of Mecca, the polytheists, and some people of the book, some followers of previous scriptures. They asked the Prophet ﷺ this question, like, what do you mean a book and you keep receiving portions of it? The Quran responded to that. كَذَلِكَ لِنُثَبِّتَ بِهِ فُؤَادَكَ. We do that on purpose to reassure your heart. وَرَتَّلْنَاهُ تَرْتِيلًا. We need it to be recited over time with kind of peaceful and piecemeal recitation to people as well. It's a dynamic unfolding discourse. It keeps addressing points and sometimes develops a point over time. It doesn't even sometimes give direct answer. It will talk about a social phenomena or a legal hukm or something over time, getting people ready, getting the environment ready for this until it reaches for example, the fight al-hukm. Now we have to ask this question. Okay, it's still possible that the Prophet ﷺ forgot parts of the Quran. How are we sure that he didn't forget anything from Jibreel alayhi salam? Again, because you Muslims are objective, don't say because the Quran said so. It doesn't make sense. You have to have another argument in addition to the promise that Allah said it's preserved. Sometimes you don't, because we believe in that promise in a different way, but sure. Can we just speculate or hypothesize about was it possible for the Prophet ﷺ to forget the Quran? Well, Allah told him in the Surah Al-A'la, سَنُقْرِئُكَ فَلَا تَنْسَى. We're going to teach you, we're going to make you recite the Quran, you will not forget. But if that was it, sure, but what does the following ayah says? سَنُقْرِئُكَ فَلَا تَنْسَى إِلَّا مَا شَاءَ اللَّهُ. What does that mean? Except what Allah wills. That means it's possible. What does إِلَّا مَا شَاءَ اللَّهُ mean? It means a nasikh wa mansukh, that sometimes Allah reveals an ayah and then abrogates or basically cancels the ayah or takes it out from the Quran. Could it mean something else? Because now we're not introducing a new question. Actually, the Quran is saying that. So that's something that we need to understand. Yes. Whatever he forgets. Okay, whatever he forgets, Allah has willed for that to happen. And it's also similar to the idea of naskh that Allah says in Surah Al-Baqarah, مَا نَنْسَخْ مِنْ آيَةٍ أَوْ نُنْسِهَا. Right? Whatever verse we abrogate or cause to be forgotten. That means he might cause him to forget verses, right? There's another qira'ah, by the way, that reads it nansa'ha, meaning that to delay it. Because like sometimes we will delay the revelation of a verse for hikmah, for wisdom that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wills. So that's one of the meanings of illa ma sha Allah. Allah will will that some of the Quran that He gives you will take it back or will cause you to forget. Or some scholars said illa ma sha Allah walakinnahu lam yasha. Like if Allah wanted to make you forget, He would, but He didn't. That's also a valid understanding. He didn't want you to forget because He promised. Because if you get to that question, it's beyond our capacity. That's in Allah's hands. Like, okay, if Allah caused him to forget, He's not responsible and we're not responsible. That's the theological aspect. So from a Muslim faith perspective, the question is not too relevant because we're responsible for what we received. And He is responsible to deliver for what He remembered, because Allah promised him that what you need to remember, you will not forget. So that's the theological aspect of it. But we have a hadith in which a companion was reciting an ayah and the Prophet loved it. And he said, may Allah show His mercy on this person. He reminded me of a verse that I forgot. قَدْ ذَكَّرَنِي آيَةً أُنْسِيتُهَا أو نسيتها. So does that mean like maybe he can forget parts of the Quran? That's a different one. This hadith doesn't say which ayah. So is there an issue about this story that might cause an issue? Yeah. Yes, for an obvious reason. Can you guess it? Yeah. So it's like you reminded me about this. It wasn't on my mind or something like that. But how are we sure about this? There's a very obvious reason. How did the Sahabi know that verse? Right? He already gave it to him. It was already there. Like people knew it and he just listened to it, because like otherwise Sahabi wouldn't make up an ayah, right? So that means he received it, he delivered it, and now people recite it and they said like, Jazakallahu khairan, he reminded me about this ayah. So he might forget, but in a kind of circumstantial way. And we have a discussion in the hadith books about when and how the Prophet ﷺ forgets, Quran or otherwise. Because we have in the hadith about salah that he wasn't sure if he prayed 2 or 4, right? And that was the hadith that established the idea of sujood al-sahw, for example. So he might forget alayhi salatu wasalam. Sometimes that can happen. But he said, we can find one instance that he forgot something that he never conveyed before. That doesn't exist. We never heard that. He said, oh, this ayah I received a couple months ago and I forgot to tell you about. That never happened. Not just because we don't have documentation of this, but also as we're going to see for the writing down of the Quran, there was always immediate delivery. Any ayah, almost everything he recited in the Quran, right away he delivers it. We have a lot of accounts of him reciting as Jibreel is like still there. We have stories of with Sayyidah Aisha radiallahu anha, he's literally like lying down on her lap and then he's receiving wahi, or sometimes with Uthman ibn Affan, and sometimes with Zayd ibn Thabit. Multiple stories. The wahi is literally descending, and then almost even before, upon the departure of Jibreel, he's reciting that to whoever is available. Or he would send the Sahabi, like, okay, I give you this, go read it to people, or go and deliver it to the other companion. The idea of direct, immediate delivery was something he cared much about, alayhi salatu wasalam. Now, how he conveyed the Quran, and that now gets to the technical structure of teaching the Quran. We have two major methods. The first one is called Iqra, and the second one is called Ard. And you can relate to that from Quranic instruction today. Iqra means the Prophet ﷺ recites to a companion, and then the companion might recite back to correct or to ensure the recitation is correct. Ard means the companion already learned some Quran, maybe from somebody else, and then he's reciting to the Prophet ﷺ. So the teacher is reciting to you, or you are reciting to the teacher? Which one is stronger for Quranic teaching or learning? Ard, so you reading to the Shaykh, not the Shaykh reading to you. By the way, if you notice, you can flip, in a way, the order for hadith. Scholars of hadith, they appreciate the Iqra more. If the hadith scholar, if you go to Imam Malik, for example, even though he didn't like that, personally, if you go to Imam Malik, it's like, I want you to recite hadith to me because I want to narrate from you. That's one of the highest levels of reception of hadith, idea of Iqra. Because I didn't just read to him. He said to me, قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم, such and such. That's considered to be like one of the highest level of tahammul, meaning reception of the text. For Quran, it's the opposite. So Quranic sciences are different here from hadith sciences, that you need to read the Shaykh, because in hadith, it's about the content more than the articulation. But in Quran, you need tajweed, you need articulation. And, you know, for you study or read to mashayikh, the tajweed and the mad and the harakat, like it has to be very kind of meticulous. So ard in general is considered to be a better side. Yes. Yes, that's a good question. I'm going to cover in detail at the end, but a quick answer, that didn't happen from the beginning because like it was different parts. So you have Surah Al-Alaq, the first 5 verses are the first revealed verses in the Quran, right? First time he received Quran was Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq. Just the first 5 verses. The remaining about 14 verses in the surah, that came after another about 30 plus chapters that were revealed. So 2 things happened: the arrangement of the verses in one surah, and then the arrangement of the order of the surah. These are 2 different processes. The arrangement of the verses that happened before he passed away, alayhi salatu wasalam, entirely, and he would, through Jibreel, we have a hadith of Jibreel coming to him, say, you know this ayah, put it after the ayah in surah kada. That happened multiple times. So that's called arrangement of ayat of surah, then arrangement of ayat verses, arrangement of chapters and surah. Both happen under the instruction of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. But more specifically, arrangement of verses is entirely divine based. It's not something that the Sahaba had any say on. Some people said about chapters, like Al-Baqarah and Ali Imran, some people said there's little ikhtilaf about maybe the Sahaba were involved in that order of which one comes first. Because we have some accounts of Al-Anfal wa Tawbah. You know, so Tawbah doesn't have Basmala. And then, okay, which one comes first? There was some hadith about, there was at least a discussion about how to place it in the Mus'haf, but just the whole surah. But within the surah, no one ever said that, oh, the Sahaba said like, oh, we're going to put this verse here. That's all kind of tawqifi, meaning that it's divine based or by the instruction of the Prophet. So I will also summarize this point towards the end, inshallah. The Iqra and Ard is to understand it, it's a process. Because number one, Ard is understood to be memory based. If you're reading from the Mus'haf, that's not called Ard. Ard means from ta'aridu ma fi hifdhik, like you're reading what's in your memory. If you read from the Mus'haf, it's okay, but that's not the technical meaning of Ard. Number two, it's an instructor-led, meaning you can do Ard to yourself. It's two-way kind of process. You need somebody, you're doing Ard. Because You see, I presenting, it has to be to somebody. That's the literal meaning of what ard is. Then 3, there are particular rules of dabt, or accuracy, that the ard has to be done within. Let's say tajweed, basically. So these are 3 conditions for what ard is. If one of these conditions is not there, that's not considered to be ard. That could be just a general qira'ah of the Quran. Now, how did the Prophet ﷺ disseminate the Quran? Something that some scholars did is that they did a massive effort, some modern Muslim scholars, of going through the seerah and the hadith books and the kutub al-shama'il, the characteristics of the Prophet ﷺ, and they said, let's find how many ways, how many styles he had to teach the Quran. I tried to group that into 2 general groups. One, there is direct teaching, and one, there is organized learning activities that he's supervising. So again, they counted a lot. So Sheikh, famous Azhari scholar, rahimahullah, his name is Muhammad Jabal, he has a beautiful book on this topic, and he extrapolated about 16 different styles of teaching the Quran. So I tried to regroup that just to in a way that could be easily understood. To some of them are like what kind of almost one-on-one or direct, and some of them is he's designing teaching of the Quran led by other people, but he's supervising and he's involved. So the direct teaching, sometimes we talk about immediate delivery. Again, every one of these, inshallah, when the book comes out, every one of these has multiple hadith that will be there. That's a whole section of the chapter on like a lot of examples for surah of the Quran, how he delivered them immediately once he revealed them, alayhi salatu wasalam. Immediate delivery, sometimes at home, immediate delivery during travel. He's literally on his camel or mount. He received the Quran and he's reciting it right away to the companions, even they are together in travel. Using Quran in da'wah, that's a whole topic. How many times people will come to him and his just way of inviting them to Islam, I'm just going to read some Quran to you. That happened a lot. Or some people who who almost decided, or basically decided to become Muslims, but they have questions. Okay, said I'm going to read some Quran to you. Or some people who already decided and they became Muslims and they came to give him like the official kind of declaration of Islam. They said like, okay, the first thing I would do to you is what? I'm not going to lecture you. I'm just going to read some Quran. That was his da'wah style, alayhi salatu wasalam. There is the one-on-one teaching in the sense that we understand today. There's the group teaching, multiple hadith. Shows up to the masjid, finds the Sahaba sitting. He sits with them. I'm going to read some Quran to you. Ahlul Sufa, the people of Sufa, they're a very crucial element of preservation of the Quran. The poor companions. Sufa is kind of a shelter that was attached to the masjid. Sahaba couldn't afford housing. They would live there until they get a job or they find a way to move out and find a place. They would live there. Been in the masjid most of the time. During that time, of course, you memorize most of the Quran. A lot of the Quran came from the Sufa. He would show up to the masjid. He always makes dua for them and praises them, alayhi salatu wasalam. He sits with them. I'm going to read Quran to you. So that's always active group teaching. Salah. He recites at least 3 prayers a day. Jahri, Fajr, Maghrib, Isha. His qira'ah is long. Today we have the idea of that Maghrib needs to be fast. No, he would recite al-A'raf in Salat al-Maghrib. Like he would recite really long portions of Quran in Salah. Every day, and the Sahaba, hundreds are praying behind him. Even in khutbah, we have female companions who memorize chapters in the Quran because of the khutbah. Because sometimes he would recite a whole surah. He recited Surah Qaf multiple times in its entirety in khutbah on Friday. And some sahabiyat, some female companions said, I memorized it because of how many times he recited it in the khutbah, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So under these 4, you can break them down into a lot of different kind of methods. And then there are the organized learning by the Prophet ﷺ. Now the Muslims are growing in number. He moved to Medina, a lot of new Muslims. He can't teach everyone. That's just not feasible. A new Muslim comes, he sits with the Prophet ﷺ, becomes a Muslim, who says some Quran. Go to Ubay ibn Ka'b, he will teach you. Go to Zayd ibn Thabit, he will teach you. These names are very important. I hope you keep them in mind because they're very crucial in the whole story of the preservation. So he started assigning Quran teachers for new Muslims. That was one of his habits, ﷺ. And then companions by themselves, so even being assigned, he would also teach each other Quran all the time. He would send companions to other regions to read Quran to people, including military leaders. Like he's literally sending a military expedition to another area. There's war that's going to happen. After you're done your military mission, stay there and teach people Quran. That happened with Khalid bin Walid and other companions of the Prophet ﷺ as well. Even travelers, people would just en route through Medina, you just stop to buy some stuff or just see what's in the market. They would meet Sahaba literally on the way. It's like, okay, we can share some Quran with you. They would learn some Quran. We knew actually stories of Sahaba. They barely met with the Prophet ﷺ a few times, But they would pass by Medina, memorize some Quran from the Sahaba, and move on. When they go back to their tribe, because you have a lot of people outside the outskirts of Medina living in the desert, you'll be there. It's like, okay, I'm the one who has most Quran. I'm going to be the Imam. They become the Imam of the community. Simply just they're passing by Medina, learning a few verses or a few surah, and every time they do that, they now have a portion of the Quran. They become the Imams of their tribes or their area that they live in. All of these are different the ways the Prophet ﷺ disseminated the Quran. You can also trace what we would call early models of Quran schools. That happened early on. You can simply think of Dar al-Arqam as early as that, like in the very beginning of the message of the Prophet ﷺ. You know, Al-Arqam is the name of that young man in Mecca who offered his house to the Prophet ﷺ to meet in secret. They couldn't even publicize anything about their da'wah. They would meet in secret. What would the Sahaba do with the Prophet in the first year of Hijrah or second year of Hijrah? Quran, really. Think of the Quran to be the driving vehicle. The most central thing in the community is just Quran. They're not studying fiqh. They're not studying like that. The whole thing, the whole religion was Quran to them. They met in Dar al-Arqam for multiple years. They couldn't meet in public. That's a Quran school in a way. And then you have Abu Bakr's house. Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anh, he had like kind of a yard, front backyard. He would sit there at night and recite the Quran out loud. He had a beautiful voice, very khasha. He would actually cry a lot as he recites the Quran. Sayyidah Aisha, his daughter radiallahu anha, praised him a lot about this. People loved his voice, people, non-Muslims. They would come around the house, city women and children, and they would just sit and listen. People got upset. They made a scene about it, and they fought with him, like, why do you do that? You're causing fitna to our young children and to the women as well. Why are you doing this? And he was like, that's private property. Like, it's none of your business. I'm just sitting in my home, I'm reading Quran. I don't care if people want to listen. He insisted, and he kept doing that. And that was considered after a while to be one small center that started to disseminate the Quran to the public. Allahu a'lam how many people eventually were guided by his recitation, but that was one style. I'm just trying to think of the most primitive ideas of how Quran was, or how Quran school was basically developed. The group learning of the Prophet ﷺ is considered to be a kind of a Quran school, Quran program. He once praised the Ash'ariyin. Ash'ariyin is a tribe from Yemen who would come to the masjid to visit him in the masjid in Medina. They would sleep at the masjid, and they would recite the Quran at night, and they had a beautiful voice. So he would feel so happy and praising. He said, I wake up and I hear the beautiful voice of Al-Ash'ariyin and the masjid reading the Quran, in group reading of the Quran. That's a kind of one. These are examples of, again, basic ideas of Quran group learning or schools or programs, whatever we call them in today's language. I spoke about people of a Suffa, the attached shelter in the masjid that had a lot of Qurra as well. And then you have the idea of, today we know it Kutab or Maktab based on your culture, where like kids learn the Quran. That had a very kind of basic, primitive style during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. You know, some Sahaba moved to Medina before the Prophet ﷺ, right? And some of them were Qurra. Mus'ab ibn Umair was a Qari. And then Abdullah ibn Maktoum, the Sahabi, was blind. He went, they established, again, what would the Sahaba do in Da'wah? Quran. They started teaching people in Medina Quran as a way of inviting them to Islam. And they lived in a house that was offered to them. And that house, surprisingly, maybe to us, was known to be Baytul Qurra, the house of Qurra, the house of reciters, or Darul Qurra. Why? Because this is what they were doing. And they would literally go and knock at the doors of people, just like, okay, we're here to invite you to Islam, we're just going to recite some Quran. That's the language they're using with people. And then people who are interested, they would come to that house they're living in temporarily until the Prophet ﷺ moves, and they would teach them Quran. So that's one of the earliest institutions that we had in our history during his life, ﷺ, of the Quran. Anecdotally, we know of the first formal organized Quran teaching for kids was during the time of Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anh. He organized what we call a maktab or kutab today. And he actually appointed a teacher to teach them Quran. He offered him a salary from the public treasury, from Baytul Mal, and he gave him a full-time job. You teach kids the Quran every day. And there's a beautiful story about him, Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anh. He traveled to one of the, to Asham, I think. And then when he was away, they said like the kids of the school, they missed him. So when they heard he's coming back, they wanted to go and receive him before he enters Medina. So they asked the teacher, and the teacher took them. A lot of people from Medina missed Umar ibn al-Khattab. So like, we're going to just welcome him and receive him outside. They went like miles away from Medina until they met him. He was very overwhelmed. He sat with them and he spoke with the kids. It was late, so they spent the night there. And then the following day, they entered Medina. The kids took that chance and they said, can we get today off? because like this now, like, you know, it's a celebration. It's a kind of a special day with the Khalifa, with the Caliph. He's the leader of Muslims, and he gave that day off. And then they kind of hinted to him that, like, it used to be about 6 days a week. That's a lot. So he gave them kind of 2 days a week to be off. And he asked the structure, like, do not ever change this. And I don't want anybody in the future to change this sunnah. He called it a sunnah, like a common practice. It's not a prophetic sunnah. It's a common practice. They get 2 days a week off. That's, you know, the first weekend in Islam, basically. So that's a very bad joke, but it's a story of his son Abdullah ibn Umar mentioned that Umar al-Khattab, the Khalifa, he would enter the masjid, sit on the minbar, and the Sahaba just come around him and he teaches them Quran. Imagine that to be a central. It's like part of his job description as a Khalifa. He would send Abu Musa al-Ash'ari, for example, to Basra. He was the wali, he was the envoy of Basra. Imagine how taunting this task is to be a wali of a major city like this. Part of his daily work was to teach people Quran in the masjid. He had a lot of halaqat, and he appointed TAs, teaching assistants for him. And then eventually, in years, he had over 1,000 students. Abu Darda went to Asham. These are the main Sahaba who were disseminated in these major regions. And he had hundreds of students, and now he has TAs and halaqat, and he would just supervise all this number. And it became very kind of formally organized teaching of the Quran. Those Sahaba were there for sometimes administrative tasks, but at the same time, Quran always has to be the main thing being taught. I have a couple more points before we finish the oral transmission, and we'll take a break, inshallah. The term Qurra is very important to keep in mind because it started to emerge very early on in our history. The earliest account of that term in our history is in the 4th year of Hijrah, specifically as referring to the 2 tragic incidents of Al-Raji' and Bi'r Ma'una. These are 2 very tragic events that happened when tribes, it's a long story, but in brief, some Arab tribes came to the Prophet ﷺ and he said, can you send us some people to teach us Quran? Can you become Muslims? No, but we're interested. So send us some people and we'll see. So he ends up sending with one group. It was 2 groups that came almost within like a month. So one group, he sent 10 companions. The other group, he sent 70 companions. All these companions went to be the Qurra. So he's sending the best Qurra in Medina to teach these people Quran, and hopefully he's hoping for these people to become Muslims. It was a deceit. It was a kind of planned. It was a plot that he planned. They ambushed them on the way. They killed all of them. And he dispatched them in 2 different times. But before he received the news about the first group, he had already dispatched the second one. He couldn't save them. So he lost within a month 80 Qurra. Anas bin Malik radiallahu anhu said, I've never seen the Prophet ﷺ sad in my entire life, and he's a very close companion to the Prophet. I never saw him showing grief and sorrow for anybody as much as he did for these people. The not cities, the wells, but area, regions, Bi'r Ma'una, it's literally the well of Ma'una, and Al-Raji', the 2 locations. By the way, this is what legislated the sunnah of Qunut al-Nawazil. You know, today when we make dua every salah for Gaza, for example, that's called qunut, meaning making dua in jama'ah, like you do in Fajr, for example, or you do when there's like a major ibtila, a major affliction that happened to the community, you make dua. That started because of this. After that happened, he used to make dua against these people who killed the Sahaba every day in every salah, alayhi salatu wasalam. He would mention them by name. He would say, Allahumma alayka bi qarra, Allahumma alayka bi adl. These are the names of the tribes that killed the Sahaba. For the Sahaba said these dua is like by name for a full month in 5 prayers in the masjid. He would make dua against them, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So that's one of the earliest references to the term Qurra. Again, the story, you can read about it. It's very inspirational. One of the beautiful things about those Sahaba is we didn't really know much about them. Beyond being Qurra, beyond people, it's beautiful because the 2 main things we know about them, 1, Qurra, 2, very, very active in social service. Because a lot of them were poor. There will be a lot of them graduated from Sufa, using the word graduated generically. Sufa people and the Qurra people were known to be, they say like they're praying and making ibadah and Quran most of the time, and they would help the elderly in the community by collecting firewood for them or like doing any kind of service, just helping people who are in need all the time. He said people would be always surprised how would they get time to do all of that. They're doing a lot of social service that are very demanding. At the same time, all the time we see them praying or reading the Quran. But all the time we hear about all these accomplishments of the service. We didn't really know much beyond that. We barely have the names of a lot of these Sahaba. If you read them, you might not really recognize the names. But see the love and the sadness the Prophet ﷺ had for them. So that's one reference to Qurra. Second reference to Qurra is the fiqhi discussion on who is the most qualified to lead Salah. So what did the Prophet ﷺ said? يَأُمُّ الْقَوْمَ أَقْرَأُهُم. different versions of the hadith. That the best in Quran recitation is the most qualified imam. The fuqaha didn't have one opinion. In schools of fiqh, they have different opinions. What does that mean? Does it mean like a perfect tajweed? Does it mean fiqh? Does it mean both? There's a debate about that. But the concept is there about the idea of being a Quran expert or an expert reciter. That is something that existed during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So this is the term Qurra. And then the second term is Huffaz, meaning memorizers of the Quran. Common question is, we have a couple of hadiths that might sound confusing. The Prophet ﷺ says, different versions, one of which is, no one has collected the Quran except four. Jama' al-Quran arba'a. Sometimes in a language that means like no one except, like it's kind of hasr. It's exclusive in these four people, and he would list four individuals. So some people say like, okay, that means you didn't have a lot of people who are memorizing the Quran. No, he didn't mean that. Number one, we have multiple versions, sometimes 4, 5, or 6, so there's discrepancy in the number. And the context is clearly about praising these to be the most expert. Because if you see the names, you know, Anas ibn Malik and Mu'adh ibn Jabal, you see the names like, okay, these are like among the most famous Qur'an. He didn't mean no one else knew Qur'an. It's like him saying, he once said, whoever wants to recite the Qur'an as if it was just freshly revealed, read it as Abdullah ibn Mas'ud does. من أراد أن يقرأ القرآن غضا طريا كما as if it just came from Jibreel. The best one is go to Abdullah ibn Mas'ud رضي الله عنه. Does that mean no one else can read the Quran properly? No, it's just like he's praising some Sahaba, he's encouraging Sahaba to learn from these individuals. So he didn't mean to limit the number in that. Again, that's one of the common questions. You didn't have enough people who memorized the Quran, so there's interruption in the isnad, back to the idea of preservation. That's not really the case for multiple reasons, one of which, see this list, 21 names. This is the most conservative number that you can come up with from all the historical sources we have. It took a lot of work, I don't mean by myself, but a lot of scholars worked on that, to come up with this list that is extremely conservative about Sahaba who memorized the entire Quran. And guess what? Before the Prophet passed away. That's very important. Because if I take that condition out, if I say like, I want to know how many Sahaba memorized the Quran, regardless of when they died, or when they finished, memorization, of course the list will be a lot bigger than this. But this is a number that we have with very extreme. So the scholars of tabaqat, of biographical entries, they would assign conditions. Anyone I'm going to include in this list, they will have to meet this criteria. They put very stringent criteria sometimes about being known to have students, being known to be active in teaching, being known to have finished before the Prophet passed away, being like early Muslims. A lot of conditions, like once you filter through the Sahaba, you'll find like a small number. The fact that you can come up with 20, and by the way, this is the Sahaba that we knew of, obviously. So to come with 21 who finished memorization before he passed away, that's a large number. Actually, some scholars said, we know a couple more Sahaba, the Prophet died and they had a couple of chapters left, we didn't include them. It's like, okay, just like one more juz and he will be a hafiz, like no. And he possibly knew that juz too, but like no, we have a condition, we have to apply that. 21 is a large number for oral transmission. For people who individually, by the way, memorize the Quran, known for their memorization, have taught the Quran too. That's one condition they added. They have to be known to teach others the Quran. And something else to keep in mind, besides that we don't know all the Sahaba, the Sahaba didn't come out and say, hey, I'm a hafiz. They didn't do that. They actually would criticize people who do that. We have multiple accounts of a Sahabi who came to another Sahabi and he said, this son of mine has memorized the Quran. And he's like, astaghfirullah. So Abu Darda's like, what are you talking about? You can't just say that. That's not something to just say or to brag about. And are you sure he memorized the Quran? And by the way, we had a different definition of what a hafiz is. It's not like we have today. It's not just about memory. Hafiz for them is someone who yahfaz the Quran both spiritually and memory as well. So if somebody is not known to be a hafiz in the sense of like they were given the Quran its due, they're not hafiz. So if you also keep that in mind, the fact that we can come up with this, I know I've been emphasizing this point, it's really impressive because like if you see the Sahaba's reaction to the idea of I'm a hafiz, they hated saying that. They wouldn't come out and say that. They wouldn't publicize that about themselves. And we have accounts of them saying, we knew people that we knew the neighbors are memorizers. They would never say that they were memorizers of the Quran. they're scared. It's a big title. It's not something easy. They're just like, oh, I'm half of the Quran. I'm now like a big shot. That's not anything. That wasn't something that the Sahaba cared about at all. But for historical purposes of making sure, again, the idea of continuity of the transmission, this is a number that we have in in our tradition about these are a lot of Sahaba memorized the Quran. Last point, some people might say, still, 20s is not a large number. Okay, but when you think of transmission, there is also the idea of collective transmission. How many Sahaba memorized Surah Al-Baqarah? Thousands, right? In the Battle of Yamama, one faction of the army were called the people of Surah Al-Baqarah, full faction. The Sahaba would call themselves in the wars by just like their association with Quranic parts. How many people memorized Juz Amma? Thousands or maybe more, right? Can that be an argument to be a collective preservation? Yes, it can. This is what happened with poetry, by the way. We know for sure that the ode, the mu'allaqa, the poem of Imru al-Qais is there. Like people don't really debate the authenticity of that. Almost no one. How many people we have in history that memorized the whole thing? We don't know, might not be a lot, but that doesn't really detract from the authenticity because we have thousands, if not millions of people who knew قِفَا نَبْكِ مِنْ ذِكْرَى حَبِيبٍ وَمَنْزِلِ. Like some people memorize the first couple of verses and other people. It's like a song that is very known and the people just memorize fragments of the song. The song is there, it's memorized, it's there. If we want to put it together, we can because we have a lot of people who have memorized it. Same thing applies to the Quran. If you include the idea of collective preservation, because people get like, yeah, if only 21, 22, it's not a large number. Number one, it is. Number two, this is not the only factor of preservation because the whole community, and again, the taraweeh, the salah, the khutbah, the teaching, the kids, all of that were collectively working together to preserve and memorize the Quran. I see that you're getting tired or bored. I hope you're not bored, but maybe tired. Inshallah, we'll take a break for 10 minutes, bidnillah ta'ala. So maybe, let's say 3:05, if that's okay. Less than 10 minutes, and then we'll be back, inshallah. I believe there are some refreshments and coffee, and then we'll, inshallah, start the second part of the written transmission. عليكم السلام ورحمة الله. الله يبارك فيك.
اسمي رضوان.
عفوا.
اسمي رضوان.
مرحبا. الله يبارك فيك.
The name of your book, because I missed the first part because I was
so it's not out yet.
I know,
it's going to be it's called How the Quran Was Preserved. There is a subtitle, but yeah, that's the
So when you anticipate to have it out?
Inshallah, we'll put it online through Yaqeen. I want to say October, bi'idhnillah. We'll circulate everywhere. I'll make sure to, inshallah, maybe reach the group here. But yeah, inshallah, that's the articles there about a lot of what I'm talking about. Not everything, but like for example, the Asma al-Quran, all of that. It's on and the same title, by the way, How the Quran was preserved during the time of the Prophet.
So you
find it online. Yeah, on the Yaqeen is you. But yeah, I updated a lot of information and added a lot of other perspectives. Inshallah, the book will be out soon.
And in the U.S. for fragments of the Quran, I think we have one in the University of Michigan. I know this for sure.
I knew about that. I'm actually going to share some images next part about the writing. But yeah, there's a lot because like There's a lot to talk about and discuss, and I would love to give you more, inshallah, opportunity for questions. So I need to make sure the Zoom people are here. Okay. So the second part will be on the written transmission. Now we spoke a lot about hifz and memorization and reception and delivery. And I hope, alhamdulillah, yani, that we covered enough of that, inshallah, or gave almost a full picture of how the reception and delivery happened, both from the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba as well. Now, to talk about the written transmission, we need a little bit also of contextual understanding or historical understanding of the situation of the Arabs and the Arabia at that time. Now, the question that I mentioned earlier, were the Arabs illiterate? Again, I'm using that in quotations because I'm sensitive to these words because they're not very accurate and they don't really describe the situation very accurately. There are a lot of ways to answer this question. I would say no, they were not, but to prove that, we can go about this in multiple ways. One way is, let's talk material evidence. Again, we said like modern people like material evidence a lot. Let's think about inscriptions, right? One of the reasons sometimes I love Twitter is, or X, is those people who just go to the desert every now and then in Arabia and keep finding about these fascinating inscriptions on rocks that go back to centuries and centuries before even Islam, that are very, very super interesting. Until today, people are finding these inscriptions. So the rock graffiti or inscriptions, there are literally thousands of them across the Arabia. And today, primarily among the very rich locations, Saudi Arabia in general, and Jordan. A lot of inscriptions, literally thousands and thousands, that with a lot of research that has been happening. It's actually one of the kind of exciting fields of study in Western Academy on the history of Arabia that directly or indirectly relate to the history of the Quran, of course. So there's massive number of inscriptions that tell us not only about Arabic, tell us about the Arabia, tell us about the culture, tell us about religion, tell us about the ancient scripts that existed even before the Arabic script. I'm not talking only about the Arabic that we know. It's about ancient scripts that the scholars recently, relatively speaking recently, they are trying to decipher what language is this. And then they started to develop some kind of connections between the ancient languages and the ancient scripts of certain languages until they're almost have, I don't see a full picture, but there is a much clearer genealogy of scripts in the Arabia that they have now. For those who are tech savvy, if you want, as I'm talking, you can Google Oceana, OCINA. It's a database developed by a Ohio State University professor. His name is Ahmed Jallad. He's one of the famous US experts on inscriptions, Arabic inscriptions. He found a lot of inscriptions, not just found, so the idea is finding and deciphering what the inscription is saying, because a lot of them are not super clear. And then he created the open access database that he just would upload the image and then give you like a full description of what the image is saying, which era, how to translate it, how to read it. It's a really beautiful database if you want to just like explore it and just have fun with like watching these kind of random images in the middle of the desert. He literally, almost every summer, he travels to one of these locations or sites in usually Saudi Arabia or Jordan. And imagine somebody walking the desert, oh, there's this random rock that I'm stepping on. I found like a couple descriptions. They don't make sense. A lot of people used to throw them, they thought they don't make sense. And then now he published a lot on them. And some of them he was able to decipher, some of them he wasn't able. So it's an ongoing research. One of the recent presentations he made, he was saying the number of unstudied inscriptions is insanely large, that he said we need generations of researchers to finish going through them. Huge, thousands and thousands of, whether it's graffiti or inscriptions. Some of them, by the way, the content-wise, they're not saying much. It's sometimes a very bored shepherd who is like with the sheep all day and just bored and would say like, oh, I'm here, ana fulan, I'm thirsty, whatever. You literally find stuff like that. Ana fulan, I love so-and-so, and I hope I will see her again. Some random, very random things. But for a researcher now, 2024, 2025, they're like, oh, if he just mentions a name, or if he just mention, I don't know, a name of the tribe, or that would make things a lot easier for the researcher to just like locate where this person was. A couple of years ago, one of the inscriptions they found, they were able to date it to be written by Hanzala. And Hanzala is one of the names of the Sahaba of the Prophet ﷺ. He mentioned his name. He mentioned the word Allah. He published a lot of things about what Allah means for the Arabs back in the days, based on inscriptions, not based on theology. They published a full paper on this. It's a beautiful, and they have a video podcast on it if you want to watch it, about the inscription by Sahabi. These things are serious for academics because, again, 50 years ago, academics were saying, some people were saying Quran came 2 centuries later. Some people were saying Mecca was in Jordan or whatever, like these kind of random things. Like now, you can't really say this anymore. That's a Sahabi. The inscription is dated 7th century. He's mentioning his name. He's mentioning other details. He's using the word Allah. He's making dua. There's information. There's really good content there that was just considered to be, okay, that's one of the very well-proven inscriptions that matches a lot of the description of the Sahabi in the books of Sirah as well. So the inscriptions, that's a very growing field across the peninsula. And now we're able to trace scripts that go BCE with centuries and centuries back. I'm going to show you a couple images, language that we can't read. You need to be an expert and have the kind of the key kind of access to the letters and the basic figures of how this script works. Some of the, again, so you can categorize inscriptions into 2 parts. Rock graffiti, which is personal. Somebody saying, I'm bored, I'm sad, I'm happy, just like random things. And that's everywhere, numbering in thousands. So when I say numbering in thousands, a lot of them are identified, but they haven't been studied. And then you have more formal inscriptions that you can find some administrative or religious content or information written or engraved on these. You'll find that more in urban centers. You're not going to find that in random locations because that's some kind of more serious content that are written. The most, or one of the richest location is South Arabia. You find a lot of that more than other regions in the Arabia. The idea of literacy, again, I'm going to keep doing this for literacy from now. South, active, multiple scripts. North, active as well, some scripts. In the middle, not as active, but there was there. I'm saying in the middle because that's Hijaz. That's where the Quran started. Mecca, Medina, that area as well. Hijaz was more interested in kind of functionally specific literacy, meaning people in Mecca would write a treatise, would write a contract, would write, when they wanted to boycott the Prophet ﷺ, they wrote that. Something very serious, something that has a kind of a political or social economic element that we need to put that in writing because it might cause dispute. But they didn't write stories, or they didn't just do their daily kind of journaling about what they did in the day. They didn't care about that much. Again, even poetry, they didn't care much. They didn't care, maybe not the right phrase, but it wasn't something that they deemed to be important to be written down. If we read something, it's administrative, political, legal. These are the common genres. Religious things weren't really written. That wasn't something that, I'm saying religious beyond Islam, of course. It's not something that was very commonly written, generally in Arabia, but specifically in Hijaz, which is in the middle. And in a minute, I will show you a map of the Arabia, inshallah. The verb kataba, the verb write or wrote, whatever the tense is, appears in the Quran 58 times. Again, you can't tell me that Quran is talking to people who never knew what writing is, and he uses that word that frequently. Right? Again, I'm kind of forcing you to believe in a certain concept that I'm trying to develop here. Other related verbs like satara or yasturun, for example, which means like to inscribe, 7 times. And then you have khatta, once, about the Prophet ﷺ, وَلَا تَخُطُّهُ بِيَمِينِكَ. It means basically the same thing of transcribing as well. Writing materials or products. You have parchment, qirtas, 2 times, pen, qalam, 4 times, book, kitab, 261 times, and folios, suhuf, 8 times. These are really large numbers given the size of the Quran of writing materials or writing tools or others. Aside from the Quran, you go to poetry. The earliest poetry we have, you have multiple references to writing. We have multiple poems that talk about things. For example, I was just talking about inscriptions. Imru al-Qais, I keep mentioning his name, one of the greatest poets of the Arabia. In his poem, he referenced inscriptions written by certain people. Taraf ibn al-Abd, another famous poet, he has references to inscriptions in Syria. Like that was something people knew about, the idea of inscribing things, the reference in that. The topic of the poem is not about inscriptions. He's talking about his beloved or whatever, but he's making tashbih or analogy or allegory based on, oh, it's like the inscriptions of such and such. Sometimes you would use words like writing or sheets about the sheets of the Jews of whatever area, or the writings of the Christians in whatever region. They know where writing is, and they know how writing was happening at that time. Even in cultural production of poetry, that was something they realized as well. Now, to think briefly about techniques of writing, common media of writing. Again, I said papers are expensive, so people use stones. That makes sense for the inscriptions we have. Palm leaf stacks, wooden sticks, pottery, sometimes metal like bronze. These are like whatever surface that can make writing feasible, they try to utilize that, because again, they can't really afford a lot of papers. These are the most common, and by the way, the order is the order of commonality. So stone is the most common. I'm talking about a little bit before Islam and into now the advent of Islam. Other materials, a little bit less common, parchment, leather, cotton, silk, other materials, all of these were also utilized. For Quran specifically, now we're getting into the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the hadith tell us about al-usub, which is the palm leaf stalks, al-aktaf, al-adla. These are words in hadith, camel bones, adim, leather, parchment, raq, papers in qirtas, splinters, likhaf. All these words are mentioned in hadiths from the Sahaba, or sometimes referencing the writing of the Quran during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Leather and parchment required a very complex production process, so it wasn't easy from that sense, because it takes time to make them. Papyrus was important because it's not something that Arabia produced at that time. Paper came, as I mentioned earlier, to the region after 7th century. So let's say with Islam, or like during that time. That's a story for one of the wars, prisoners of wars, Chinese prisoners of war, specifically after one battle. They introduced paper making to Samarkand, Persia, and then eventually it started to come to the area. A lot of videos and documentaries on the making of paper, interesting for those who are interested in this topic. By the 6th to 7th century, ink and paint, we have evidence of ink and paint being used in Arabia. You see the coincidence that is happening here with now the soon to start the active transcription of the Quran. We don't have a lot of archaeological evidence for this, but there are a lot of kind of evidence for it. So if you look at the map of the Arabia, as I mentioned earlier, there is south, there is north. This is more active. Again, I'm sorry if you can't see from the back. I hope we can switch out the lights for a little bit. One of the famous scripts is called al-Musnad. It's symmetrical, geometric. There are a lot of descriptions for it. And then another cursive script that came kind of branched off from that is known to be as Zabur. It's commonly found on wood and palm leaves. These are common in the south, close to Yemen and the south of Arabia. Al-Musnad developed into kind of other distinct styles afterwards. In the north, you have the Nabatean script. That's the most common script in that region, and then it was related to Aramaic, and it was also common in the Levant or in Asham at that time. And south and north are distinctly known for their specific kind of scripts that they use. I'm not talking about Arabic yet, by the way. Arabic, not the Arabic we know today. These are suspected, or for a long time, some scholars thought al-Musnad is the origin of Arabic, but now this is not really true. But they're studying these ancient scripts to say, like, how can we get to, like, when did the Arabic script, the alif and the ba and the ta we know today, how did it come into existence? So a lot of people thought it's a transformation of one style of al-Musnad, but this opinion now is largely dismissed for multiple reasons. This is al-Musnad, for example. We can't read it. I mean, we, but not everybody, because there are people who are like studying these things and now they know how to read it. That's an image in the National Museum in Sana'a in Yemen. I highly respect copyright, so don't worry. That's like I obtained that through legal ways. So this like that's not a stolen image. That's how al-Musnad used to look like, but we're talking now centuries and centuries before the Quran and before the time of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. Another example, this is Zabur. I mentioned there's a cursive style that came from al-Musnad that is called al-Zabur. clearer script, but can anybody read it? Yes, and also the materials, of course. A lot of these were not, and like the typical kind of papers or sheets as we know them. Also, there's the reference and the citation where the image is coming from. But this is another ancient script that was used by people in that region. This is another one of Nabatean Arabic, you can call it this way. A lot of these scripts, we call them Arabic, but ancient Arabic. So again, when we say Arabic, don't think of the letters that we know of today. These are earlier. This one is 3rd century. So 3 or 4 centuries before Islam. So it's now known to be a Nabatean Arabic. It's in King Saud University, the source of the image. There are a lot of them, and again, if you open Oceana, you can again play with the database. You can see a lot of inscriptions. You can even go earlier than that. You can go BCE before than that, and again, it's a kind of OCINA. Yeah, it's powered by Ohio State University, and then or you type that, you type Ahmad Jallad, that's the name of the scholar, and then you find. I wanted to add a slide with the website, but I forgot to do that. Okay, the reason I'm showing this just briefly, it's not, of course, we're not studying now ancient scripts, but the point is, how can we get to the idea of like, how did the Arabic came into existence the way we know about? First, to think of the influence of like that led to the development of the Arabic script. Multiple factors, but 2 important factors. One, the Christian movement of writing was very active at that time. So Christian missionary activity used to happen in the Arabia. And understanding the religious context is important because you have Christians in multiple regions of the Arabia. We have Jews as well. These are people of the book, people of scripture. They have scripture, they have history, they have writing, religious writing activity in particular. And a lot of them were also interested in converting people to Christianity as well. That's why we have Arab tribes who converted entirely to Christianity. Tayyip, for example, famous tribe, it's a Christian Arab tribe because of these missionary work. And through the missionary work, they were teaching people script sometimes. So that was one thing. And by the way, it's interesting because all the way until after the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the profession of scribe was very common among Christians, that Sahaba and Tabi'een, it's actually really late in our tradition, they would commission Christian writers to scribe Quran for them, to transcribe Quran for them. Multiple accounts of that. If Tabi'i Fulan, he commissioned the Christian writer to produce a copy of the Quran for them, and he paid him 500 dirhams. We have multiple accounts like that. There's a book called Kitab al-Masahif, about the history of Mushafs in general. Imam ibn Abi Dawood, he has multiple accounts of that. Tabi'een and Sahaba, the likes of Abdullah ibn Abbas, he had a scribe he commissioned. All of them are Christian names. Arab Christians who are from these tribes who became Christians, they took, writing is a profession, or transcribing is a profession. So they would pay them money and they would write Mus'haf. You can trace that, okay, now that makes sense with the early influence of the Christian kind of writing movement that led to some level of literacy. The other factor to keep in mind is multiple Arab tribes would develop allyship with other Roman affiliated rulers. We hear the word Ghassasina or the Ghassanids. These are allies of Byzantine or the Byzantine Empire. And then they had Arabs as part of their people they governed. And they had administrative positions for some Arabs, and they introduced these positions to the Arabs. The Arabs learned from them a lot about administration. And part of administration is to document things. Right? I have a person who writes my treaties, my message to the other tribe or to whatever. So they taught these people both administrative structures and writing as well. And that was one way that got writing to be active in Arabia. These are not the only reasons, but these are 2 very important factors that happen, we're talking right before the time of Islam. We have a script in our sources, Islamic sources, that called Al-Jazm, that came before Al-Kufi. Now we know what Kufi Rasm is like this, how we know the Quran to be written. Hijazi and Kufi, these are very common names of scripts. Khatt al-Kufi and Khatt al-Hijazi, Kufic script or Hijazi script. Before that, we have traditions calling them Al-Jazm. That was a phase of the development of the Kufic Rasm. A lot of people thought, again, that the Jazm, Kufi, Hijazi came from Musnad. That's now rebutted, very kind of not really accepted anymore by most kind of scholars. For multiple reasons, one of which we see now noticeable stylistic differences. They don't really match in a lot of ways. We have a little bit of more plausible opinion that the Arabic script came through a Syriac genealogy. A lot of people in modern times, they were interested in studying Syriac, the language and the script as well. And it came through the Tayy tribe that I mentioned, the Christian Arab tribe, through Al-Anbar and Al-Hira in Iraq. And then we have some historical accounts from the Tabi'een that those people moved, or they used to come to Mecca, they taught Abu Sufyan, they taught Umar ibn al-Khattab, they taught some people, and they taught the Sahaba. Then we went to, one of the Tabi'een said, in Medina, I asked the young Sahaba, how did you learn writing? They said through all, and they narrated that chain of the people of Al-Hira and Al-Anbar and Tayy came to Mecca, taught these people, they taught us, and then that's a story. It's not very authentic, it's not very verified, it's just an anecdote about what possibly could be the origin of writing. Today, with the material evidence we have, and that's one of the values of really having material evidence, and the epigraphy that we have of all these inscriptions, the most plausible explanation is Nabatean. That's really one of the common opinion in studies across, it's not just Western and Islamic Muslim scholars as well, is that the Arabic script doesn't really go back to Syriac, it goes back to Nabatean script. And of course, that went through development. And then there are people who are Arabists. They're interested in unique features of Arabic language. They compare letters between these scripts and languages. They compare the way the letter is inscribed or written down. So that's a field of studies. And again, people are still finding more inscriptions. Mecca, Medina, Ta'if, you still have these inscriptions that they continue to tell us about the origin of the Arabic script. Okay, this is one of the very early Quranic manuscripts. It's in Kufic script. So again, we're going to concede, that's the common word now, that the Kufic script is coming through an Nabatean script and developed into what we know today to be Arabic. This is very early, the 7th to 8th century, so very early, like the first year of Hijrah. In the first year, second year Hijrah. It's now where the image is stored now is in Manama, is in Bahrain, and it's in Kufic script. Can somebody read or guess? Sorry, I was planning to prepare a prize for this, but I didn't bring anything, so I can thank you for the answer, or promise you something later. Okay, can you decipher a word or two? It doesn't have to be, you don't have to know that. So, I mean, if you're Hafid and you got a couple words, you might be able to guess, but can you read a word or two? And as you see, it's part of it is torn, so it's missing a piece. Sorry, you're saying. An-nas? Okay. Salam? Yeah. Okay, sorry, let me keep thinking about it, but I have a question. Do you see dotting or diacritics? Yes. Yes, it's in Surah Al-Ma'idah. So if, sorry, I'm just gonna go 1 second. If you see from here, I think it's 90 something verse. لا تقتلوا الصيد وأنتم حرم. And then if you know the ayah, you can go the rest of the Surah Al-Ma'idah about the penalty for hunting or killing animals during ihram. So do you see diacritics or dots? Okay, why? Okay, that's a common thing that I do not agree with. That's why I asked this question. Yeah, it's common that, oh, they didn't know dotting and then they introduced it afterwards. Not really, because we have older writings that have dottings. Same opinion, that it came afterwards, and I'm challenging that. Sure, but I'm asking why. So now 2 questions. Why didn't they have dotting? And 2, if they knew dotting, why didn't they include it? So you're saying the second question, that because that style does not have dotting. Good point. So they wanted to accommodate different pronunciations. Okay, yes. Back. Oh, okay. So they were smart enough to read without that. Okay. 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 Yes. Okay, I will give a brief comment on this. Yes. Possibly. But what I'm arguing for now is it was intentional. So maybe that's the factor, economic factor, but it was intentional that they left. Even before that, even the Sahaba, the Mus'haf Uthman, when so I know that's not part of what we're talking about, but I said there's Jama' Abu Bakr. Abu Bakr did one Mus'haf, then they formed the second committee, the second time, the committee during the time of Uthman, under the leadership of Zayd ibn Thabit, they wrote it again, right? So that Uthman's Mus'haf, they did not include dotting or diacritics purposely. It wasn't because they didn't know it. And do we have any, does anybody know if we have any copies or fragments of Uthman's Mus'haf today? Birmingham, okay. Where else? In Istanbul, okay. If you visited Topkapi in Istanbul, you find the famous, okay, so I hate to ruin it for you, but a lot of these are not authentic. There are a lot of studies on this. So there are the most famous locations where the copies are said to be Uthman's is the one in Istanbul, that's one. There's one in Egypt, in Masjid al-Hussein. And the third one is in Tashkent, has a very interesting story. These are real manuscripts of the Quran, because during the Russian invasion of Tashkent, they actually took it. And they kept it within for years. And then after some kind of things settled down, there was a lot of negotiation to bring it back. And then they eventually gave it to Muslims, and they put it now in a mathaf, in a museum in Tashkent. So these are the three most famously known to be Uthman's, or fragments. They're not full copies of the Quran. But none of them is verified to be Uthman's Mus'haf. And we have stories from scholars who said people would make stuff up, bring in like an old copy and just put some blood on it. It's like, that's Uthman, he was killed here. No, they just added some blood just to maybe attract some people to see it. So none of these are actually, these are like, there's debate about, they're early manuscripts. That's one thing. And again, there are a lot of writings in both Arabic and English on this topic, but none of them is really very well verified. We don't really have definitively, or a definitive proof that any of these is Uthman's Mus'haf, or any of the copies that Uthman sent to the regions, because he kept copy with him in Medina, and then he sent multiple ones. I mentioned 4, 5, 7. There are different accounts to the different Muslim regions. So yeah, that's just a point. And you still can see them. It's fun and nice to watch that one in Istanbul or in Egypt or anywhere, but these are not really Uthman's Mus'hafs. So that's an early kind of manuscript of the Quran. Now look at this one. How easier it became. It's much easier. That's why I didn't put any description. So can you guess? Can you first read which surah or ayah? Yeah, that's one thing we need to observe as well. So you notice here, not only there was a line that separates the two surahs, there's a kind of like what you see in the Mus'haf today, surah kada, having surah al-Ra'd, for example, وَفِيهَا ayat sajda. Like, do you have these details that sometimes you So how late you would guess this after the previous one? 4 centuries. Because now you have colors too, right? There are actually red kind of dotting. And that's something early scribes of the Quran did for multiple reasons. You have Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. That's for the Shafi'is, right? Because yes, it's an ayah from each surah. That's one of the arguments for the madhab al-Shafi'i, that Bismillah is an ayah because the Sahaba wrote it before every surah. That's not Sahaba's Mus'haf, but it's a common thing in translation of the Quran to put the Basmala before every surah. There are dottings, of course. There are even some kind of what we call tashkil. There are some diacritics as well. So yeah, so you said about 4 centuries later. It's actually not. It's like 1 to 2. That's what I'm saying. When you look at the previous one, think, yeah, they didn't know writing. Like, no, very shortly after they wrote that. That doesn't happen in decades or a century. Right? People knew a lot about writing, about the Sahaba knew orthography very well. Actually, scholars kept being very impressed. I'm like, how did they know all of that? How they made these very deliberate decisions? I'm going to give you some examples. Next slide, actually, about very deliberate decisions about very minute differences in the writing of the Mus'haf. So that's another fragment of the Quran. This one is 8th century, very early, second, third Hijri. That's also early manuscripts. You didn't all look the same. You have a lot of other factors. Yes. I mean, not the Sahaba, not Uthman's, but yeah, it's material, no. And Uthman, we don't also have something definitive, but we have more. So as I mentioned, the idea of studying the ancestral codices that gave a lot of people who were interested in material evidence very high probability that, okay, Uthman's Mus'haf, the idea is, yes, there was an original Mus'haf. Abu Bakr is less from that material evidence perspective. So I mentioned that the Sahaba left out some these styles on purpose for multiple reasons. Let's just reflect on this together. How many people studied Tajweed before? Okay, how many people remember or know about ta al-maftuha and ta al-marbuta? Right? And if you study Matn Jazariya, for example, so the easy way to remember these things through Matn, you need to memorize a poem that just gives you all the words that are maftuha or not. So if you study Jazariya, because sometimes the Quran, you see Rahmah, like the one on the left, and the Rahmat with ta, maftuha, right? The Mus'haf has that. It's difficult to memorize when without looking at the Mus'haf, so that's why the scholars write mutun for this. So you study Matn Jazariya, wa Rahmat az-Zukhrufi bitta zabara al-a'rafi minhu dikaf al-baqara. You know, like these are all the instances in the Mus'haf where it's that maftuha or not. Why is it written like this? Why are we opening Surah Maryam? Kaf, ha, ya, ayn, sad, dhikru rahmati, and the ta is like maftuha, it's like the open one. But in other ayahs, like rahmah with ta that is closed. Why? No difference on the meaning, by the way. Right? Contextual meaning might differ, but like the word, as a word, no difference. Is there even, it's a tricky tajweed question for people with tajweed, is there even a difference in qira'ah? Can I pick on some people? Is there a difference in qira'ah, in the way you recite it, whether it's open or not? Yes. Yes. Yes, it's when you pause. So if I want, I mean, usually nobody will pause dhikr rahmat, it's the beginning of the ayah, but let's say you had to, if you say dhikr rahmah and you pause, that's wrong. If it's maftuha, if it's open, you need to say dhikr rahmat. And usually if you do like an involuntary pause, you go back to dhikr rahmati rabbika abdahu zakariya. If it's the other one, then you say rahmah, just because it's a ha. It's called ha, actually. So why did the Sahaba, and that goes back to the Sahaba. Sahaba did that, by the way. Why did they write it like this? You know, there is a Western academic, is not Muslim, who took only one word, ni'mah, the third one. And he made a study comparing the numbers of times in early manuscripts of being written open or not. And his conclusion was there is no way whatsoever that was coincident. He said it looks like every time they put it in either style, it was intentional. And his major conclusion was, again, there is like an ancestor to that. There's an original Mus'haf people were copying. Because when you look all these manuscripts, second, third Hijri century, for example, you find like, okay, it looks like they're copying the same style and they're purposely alternating between the maftuh and the open and the closed for a reason. So he had I think he called the title of the paper God's favor, using the word ni'mah as favor, which is an interesting study. That's only one word. And you see here the numbers. So the frequency. So the frequency with ha, let's talk about rahmah, the first one. Frequency with ha closed 72 times. But the one that is open 7, that's why Ibn al-Jazari, he would open only the open one. He would, only document the opened ta, because that's the fewer number. Sunnah, 8 and 5, pretty close. Sunnat or sunnah with ha. So you see now the numbers. Can you think of any plausible reason why they will alternate like that? Specifically that, again, meaning doesn't really matter how you write it. Yes? Hmm. Mm. Yes, there are these stylistic, but by the way, Imra'atu Imran is open and she's Muslim. So it has meaning, but it's not the primary meaning. Okay. Okay. Yeah. I was talking about Imran, but I get your point about like, is it attributed to a person or not? Like the wife of so-and-so or not. So aside from the meaning point, you said it's because from God, but the Quran wasn't given as a book. So the Sahaba wrote it like this. So the question is, did the Prophet ask them to do it like this? Or that's the point. But it wasn't written by Jibreel. The Sahaba wrote it down. Okay, so yeah, so the Prophet told them to write like this. Okay. Mm. Mm. Yes, so that's correct, but not necessarily about these examples, but they did that too. So for example, how is the word Maliki Yawmiddin is written? Malik, how is it written in the Mus'haf? Mim, Lam, Kaf, right? We have two famous qira'at here, Maliki or Malik. The way it's written without alif, it accommodates both readings, right? Because alif doesn't have to be written in that style. That's why now with the Mus'haf with the Tashkil, you see like this small tiny alif and like between the mim and the lam, it's there for that. So you can read it as is. If you never knew Surah Al-Fatiha, you can say Malik or Malik. Both, they did that a lot. And that was one of the reasons that they wanted to accommodate. They didn't want to force people to recite it in one way because they knew there are other different qira'at. That happens a lot, like yuda'ifu, yuda'ifu. Like you have a lot of qira'at that will be influenced by this. But sometimes it becomes tricky because you have qira'at that drop the whole letter. So وَسَارِعُوا إِلَى مَغْفِرَةٍ مِّن رَبِّكُمْ, and then other qira'ah سَارِعُوا. So there is waw before in some qira'ah and without a waw in other qira'ah. These are authentic, like mutawatir qira'at. So we need to think about how that happens. So one of the answers is the copies that they made, they put it in some and some they didn't. We don't have material evidence for that, but this is the assumption. Some scholars said, so some mushaf they would add the waw, and some mushaf they would not add the waw so people can know, okay, these are like two ways that the Prophet ﷺ taught the companions. Very few examples like that. Most examples of qira'at will be accommodated by the way they actually transcribed the text. For these particular examples, there is another reason that is very interesting. The Sahaba wanted to preserve archaic forms of how these were written. This is what we know today with the study of ancient Arabia, because the modern studies said the open ta, that was the predominant style before Quran. But by the time they were transcribing the Quran, there was a shift in the transcription style that now people are just writing the ta differently. So the Sahaba adopted the most updated, or the kind of the most up-to-date style of writing, but he wanted to let people know, but we had another style that we are going to document for you that was there before. So they kept that number of the open ta, which is few, on purpose for that. This is also related to some material evidence that inscriptions, for example, you find a lot of ta like that. Actually, a lot of according to Ahmad al-Jalad, when he recites sometimes the text on these inscriptions, most of the ta's, if you watch one of his lectures, he recites them ta, like with not ha. And I think he argues that the ha this way wasn't actually common in ancient Arabia. But by the time of the transcription of the Quran, it's the common way now. So they wrote it. So imagine how much they thought about these details, that we're going to keep that so people know. Actually, it could be a contribution to ilm by the Quran or by the Sahaba, that we're going to preserve all the styles of just how the language is written. Even though again the impact on the meaning will not be that much. And then that became a distinct style of the Quran, Rasmul Quran. It's a whole ilm, a whole science. That is, people who study qira'at, there's a ilm that's called Rasmul Mushaf or Rasmul Qira'at. They go through a lot of more details on it. Yes.
Difference in style, not just their like a script difference, but also dominantly their speech. They also say with that.
Before that time. Yes. It's a little phenomenon, yeah. but later before. So by the time of the Sahaba, it became a thing. The ha marbuta, the closed one. So that's why they adopted it for a lot of, the default became in the Quran, the closed one, but they wanted to preserve the old style too. We didn't know exactly how they picked that. The general objective was we need to preserve the old style. But that was it. But did they pick it more specifically like the one with Zakaria, ذكر رحمة ربك عبده زكريا? Did they intend, so one objective was we need to preserve this style. The other objective, and in this ayah, we don't know why. We can reflect on that. We can have, but we can't 100% know why. We don't have like reports or hadiths that would tell us. They did that for the ayah, and even scholars of Tajweed al-Qira'at don't give us answers to that. Like they did that for Maryam, Surah Maryam, I mean, because this ayah is that. There are reflections on this. There are, I think the sister mentioned that some scholars reflected on sometimes imra'at because they mean something. If imra'ah means something else, yes, these are some reflections. You're not going to find answers for every single one of them like that. So it's a point of reflection. But the general objective was the style of writing the Quran. It's a professional style of transcription that they had linguistic objectives for it. And the oral, again, memory and the oral transmission continues. Like people are reciting, but now they're matching with what the Sahaba have written. Sure. Mm-hmm.
Is this something that we discovered through research?
No. It's an old discussion. Again, it's not only his field. A lot of other scholars as well. But I mean, he's one of the most active ones now. They're giving us a kind of a bigger picture about studying the ancient inscriptions and knowing what was the most common ta, for example. So they couldn't match the pronunciation. It's a whole methodology, but they couldn't match the pronunciation of ha in old ancient Arabic. It's not a common thing. People saying ta more than ha. That's something that the ha in this style, of course. So, and they could also trace some letters when they came into existence. So it's very interesting. But again, we're talking centuries and centuries back. So this is what they added. But the idea of rasm, that's ilm that has been there for Muslim tradition for a long time. They always provided reflections and reasons. The idea of the Sahaba preserving old styles, Muslim scholars mention that. It has been said. Yes. عليه الصلاة والسلام. عليه الصلاة والسلام. Quraysh. Yes. 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 This is the command that Uthman radiallahu anhu gave to the committee. So he told them, now you are the committee, there are 4, or some people say more than, actually 5 or 7. He told them, like, write it down. If you disagree on how to write a specific word, write it اكتبوه بلسان قريش. Write it in how Quraysh recites it. We don't know how many times they disagreed, but we have a couple examples. The word at-tabut, for example, Surah Al-Baqarah, they actually debated, the Sahaba debated, should it be tabuh with ha or tabut with ta maftuha. There's an interesting story between them, and that's one example of they themselves ikhtalafu. They debated how we should write it down. The assumption is they didn't have a lot of disagreements, but they had a couple of disagreements, and that's why he wanted to give a reference point to them. He didn't mean to cancel every other kind of Arab tribe, but he said we have to have a reference point, because if you have ikhtilaf, and these ikhtilafat, they're not going to change the Quran. They're not going to change the content of the Quran. So a lot of them are, you can say, stylistic or linguistic as well. So for the sake of time, one more example about other purposes why they would write certain words in certain way. You might have thought before, why is salah is always written like this in the Quran? Why there is wow and it's not plural, it's not salawat, it's salah. We still read it as as-salah. Now there is another objective, which is morphology. We need to know the origin of the alif. What was it? If it's related to wow, then we're gonna put the wow to remind the reader that the asl, the origin of the letter is wow. That's a morphology kind of objective. Same thing with al-alif, al-layyina or al-ya, al-husna. This alif, right? We see al-husna should be alif, as we read it in the regular conventional writing, not Quranic writing. But the Sahaba kept it like this because the origin of this alif is ya, right? That's a whole morphology topic and also a qira'at topic as well. So people who study qira'at, if you do an imala, the inclination of the voice, so al-husni or al-husni, for example, how to do that in some qira'at based on the origin of the letter. Nobody reads a salih, that you're not going to find that qira'at because it's a wow. It should be ya. You see al-husni, but you don't see a salih. That's even though it's both alifs. Why one alif is imala, one is not? It's based on the origin of the watil ya, as you call it in qira'at. It has to be originally, in the morphological construction, has to be ya. Hamza is a huge, complicated topic, of course. And when it's added, when it's not, the hamazat written and waw written alone, that's very big topic. But again, the qira'at tradition came in part, of course, again, the oral delivery is always there, but the writing of the Mus'haf was phenomenally, really brilliant by the Sahaba, how they really took care of a lot of these details with the most, you would imagine any human effort, even if it's like 1-2% of mistakes, will be fine. But it's even very difficult to find that. I know we don't have the actual copy, but like the conformity between the Quran tradition between people is just unbelievable. It's remarkable that how people were very consistent with the ikhtilafat, with the variations, with the idea of ahruf and qira'at and how the people recited words in different ways. Still that, subhanAllah, until today, something that people are continue to be interested in. I mentioned briefly earlier about the idea of ummiyun, the Quran calling the Arabs ummiyun and calling the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam an-nabiy al-ummi. Same word, plural and singular. It appeared 6 times in the Quran, 4 plural about the Arabs in general, and 2 singular about the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. For the Arabs, again, you can now check whatever Quran app you have or website, and then you find unlettered people, sometimes illiterate people. That's the most common thing. We've been challenging through the seminar today the idea that it's not illiteracy the way we understand it today. There is a deeper link, and I'm not saying this is wrong. A lot of people also weren't like in the profession of writing or weren't really like expert writers. That's something we agree with historically. But the Quran had a deeper meaning for that beyond calling Arabs the unlettered people. The deeper meaning, that's an argument, is that it's contrasting these people with the people of the book. So to give you an example, one of the 4 times of the plural ummiyun, Quran says what? وَقُلْ لِلَّذِينَ أُوتُوا الْكِتَابَ وَالْأُمِّيِّينَ أَأَسْلَمْتُمْ, and say to those who were given the book and the ummiyin, have you submitted to God? If the meaning is just unlettered, what's the point of people of the book and the unlettered people? There's a contrasting happening here. That's why one of the translations I like, I don't think any Quran translation has, at least English. I think old Hebrew translations actually have very interesting translations of this word. But it's basically people without a scripture. The scriptureless, the unscriptured, whatever you want to say. Why? Again, I'm not negating the idea of that a lot of them didn't read or write. That's historically correct. But the idea is those communities had scripture, you didn't. You as the Arabs, you didn't. You know the concept of Gentiles? In the biblical tradition, they call the Arabs Gentiles. The meaning is you didn't have a book. Actually, the Yahud, the Jews, used to call Muslims the Ummiyin, even before the Quran. Why? You're scriptureless. You don't have scripture. We do. That was a kind of a bragging or a kind of something they took pride in. So the Quran parallels that culture because since Ismail alayhi salam, see how far back until the Prophet alayhi salam, the Arabs never had a prophet or a book. Or never had a book specifically. We didn't know much about, like we can't be definitive about prophets. But no scripture from Ismail alayhi salam, who's the great-great-grandfather of the Prophet alayhi salam, all the way to the Nabi alayhi salam. But of course, you had other scriptural communities that had books and had this idea of connection. So I like to look at it in a broader sense to be people who are inexperienced with scripture. The Arabs didn't know, like they didn't have like a scripture as a book they read and in salah or something, or even preserved with elite. That wasn't the case for the Arabs versus the Christians and the Jews. Now thinking about the Prophet ﷺ, things get a little bit more controversial. He's known to be a Nabi al-Ummi, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Again, you can say the unlettered person or the unlettered prophet. When Jibril came to him, "Iqra ma ana biqari." It's interesting because like doesn't literally mean I don't know how to read or write, but it also includes that. But it looks like he's saying something beyond I don't know how to read or write. So did the Prophet ﷺ know how to read or write? Yeah. So that's the predominant opinion. Is it wrong to say he knew some level of writing? Or this is bid'ah, kufr, controversy? It's open discussion? Okay, you said it, I didn't. You know, there's a famous scholar, imam and jurist, Andalusian, Imam al-Baji. He held that opinion. Not the only one, but he was famously said, no, the Prophet knew how to read and write. And he wrote a book about that. The book is available, is there. It's a risala. And he caused controversy, and people attacked him a lot. I don't mean to be racist, but Andalusian version of Islamic tradition was interesting. So like they were very aggressive, and it's like, no, and some people like, that's almost kufr. I was like, it was a big deal. And then he had to defend himself by writing the treatise. And then that wasn't enough. He kept asking other scholars, can you defend my position? He actually wrote to scholars in the East, asking them, can you support my opinion? Some of them said, we didn't agree, but it's not a big deal. Like these people are wrong to attack you, but we don't agree. Some people agreed. It was a very interesting debate that lasted for a number of years. But he said, it's not unplausible. It's not. So the Quran says, one of the arguments of the other side, the majority opinion, Allah says, وَمَا كُنْتَ تَتْلُو مِنْ قَبْلِهِ مِنْ كِتَابٍ وَلَا تَخُطُّهُ بِيَمِينِكَ. You never read a book before that. Again, see the idea of you're not experienced with the scripture. You're not from that community who had idea of Torah and Injil. You don't know that. And you people don't. You're direct family and tribe. You never recited a book before this, and you never transcribed one with your right hand. وَلَا تَخُطُّهُ بِيَمِينِكَ. So that means you don't know how to write. So Imam al-Baji said, yeah, but he said before this book, he didn't say afterwards. Right? Is it possible that later he knew how to write? That's one thing. The other thing, I think a lot of us know the story of Hudaybiyah. When the Prophet wrote the treaty with the people of Mecca, he asked Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anh, to write it. He said, write from Muhammad, the messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to the people of Mecca, such and such. They got angry. They said, no, we didn't believe you're a messenger. Delete that or erase that. So he asked Ali, erase it. So Ali said, like, no, I can't. I'm not going to erase your name. Like he was very annoyed. A lot of Sahaba were feeling like they're pressured to enter into this agreement. He said, no. The famous story, now it's interesting, says the Prophet ﷺ said, okay, show it to me, I will erase it. Because he doesn't know how to read. So he erased it. That's one version of the story. Another, and again, before it's like, is this authentic? Yes, it's in Bukhari. So like you can find that like in a lot of authentic sources. He said that the narration said literally, he took it from Ali ibn Abi Talib, he deleted it, and he wrote, this is from Muhammad, the messenger of Allah. And then he gave it to Ali to continue writing. Yes. So now that caused a long discussion, like, okay, did he learn how to read and write? The minority opinion, like Al-Baji and those scholars said, like, yeah, see, that's another example. And we have other examples of him asking the scribes of the Quran, show me this letter, fix the dad, fix the ra. We have some accounts like that. Now, all of them are authentic, but we have accounts of him commenting on how letters are shaped in the transcription of the Quran, because he used to review sometimes what they're writing. So that opinion said, it looks like he learned. But you can look at it in a more nuanced way, because again, it's the strict definition of literacy. If some of you knew very old people, maybe back home, who didn't know how to read or write, they could sign documents, right? I had one of my grandmother, she didn't really know writing, but she could sign. She can see her name, and you might say, we're not going to call it writing, we're going to call it, she's drawing her name. So maybe this is what he did, so we're still consistent. He didn't know how to write. So there is a response to this argument about, yeah, he wrote in the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, he didn't write a full document. That's why a basic level of literacy is not really like far-fetched to believe that he got an idea about like how to write. It doesn't contradict the Quran. But more importantly, what made those scholars angry? They thought, against the other opinion, they thought that if you say that, the mu'jiza breaks down, the miracle breaks down. Because the whole idea is, he didn't know how to read or write. How come he produced this amazing text if he doesn't know how to read or write? it's not really dependent on that, because even if somebody knows how to read or write, you can't produce a Quran. That's like just you can't. Nobody could. Nobody ever was able to do that challenge. And again, specifically, he wasn't a professional scribe. He was nobody said that. He said he knew a kind of a level of writing or reading. The whole point is the idea of ummi. Again, that's my general point. Is not just to tell, hey, you didn't know how to read or write. That wasn't just the point. It's included at one level, but the point is that's a new experience for you. That's a new book. Now you have a book to define yourself with, as opposed to the other scriptural communities, as opposed to the Christians or the Jews. You had a question? Mm-hmm. Yes. So that was what made the scholars say that's a bid'ah and heretic and all of that. And the idea was, number one, nobody's talking about a very high level of writing and ittila' that he read all of these traditions. Number two, the argument of ijaz is stronger than this, that even if somebody is the greatest poet and writer, they can't produce the Quran. The idea of mu'jiza has to be even above that level. Because if like, okay, what if Allah made him not unlettered? Would that change the nature of the Quran? No, it's still miraculous by its essence. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So, sorry, finish your question. Mm. Mm-hmm. That was my point too. That the idea is not a binary. It's not a sharp binary. Like, okay, he had no idea what writing is, or he was like a writer of like a literary text. That's a huge spectrum, right? So that what we conclude, as you mentioned, is one, there is almost consensus that he didn't know writing in a very, very professional, advanced sense. But it's not very implausible to think that he knew a basic level. And by the way, if somebody follows the majority, still the majority opinion that he didn't know, that's valid. That's a lot of indications give to that. Just not definitive, but of course that's the majority opinion of the scholars. Nabi al-Ummi means he didn't know how to read and write, but this is not the only meaning of the word. This is what I kind of care more about. And again, if you're interested in the idea, I try to trace the English and non-English translations of the Quran. Most of the non-Muslim produced very old English translations of the Quran used Gentiles. They don't care about literacy at all. Actually, a lot of them believe the Prophet knew how to read and write. And some of that based on historical evidence, some of that based on bias, that they didn't believe that it's revelation. So they think it was composed and was a process of composition, and for sure he was helped by somebody else. So that's why the common word in academy is that no, he knew how to read and write. He was familiar with biblical tradition, so that's a whole different spectrum. The Hebrew translations of the Quran, specifically the old ones, used Gentiles, use interesting translation like the native prophet or the people who didn't have prophet. Like they have very interesting translations like that. Most of the Orientalist translations focus more on the idea, which I agree with one dimension of that's a broader context. And by the way, it's in the Islamic tradition. Tabari talks about that, for example, the Mufassir. So it's an Islamic tradition, but Islamic tradition is saying, you know what, it means both. But these people are saying, no, it just means the people who are not from the people of the book. That's a very strict kind of tafsir of the ayah. It's 5:09. How long you guys are willing to stay? Ouch, that was very painful. Good, thank you. Okay, we can take, inshallah, I promise, maximum 10 minutes, if that's okay with everybody. We started a little bit late to finish a couple more points about transcription, and we'll conclude, inshallah. There are two very important terms about the compilation of the Quran. You find it in the tradition, jam' and ta'lif. These are two different words. I think proper translations are collection is jam', compilation is ta'lif. These are technical terms. You find them in al-Bukhari, for example. There are chapters, Babu Jam' al-Quran, the chapter of the Jam' of the Quran. Another chapter, Babu Ta'lif al-Quran, the chapter of the Ta'lif of the Quran. So one has to do with collecting materials, one has to do with arrangement. So these are the two kind of technical terms. During the time of the Prophet ﷺ, he had scribes. That's a big topic. He had scribes who write so many different things, one of which, of course, is the Quran. The term scribe was applied to any Sahabi that the Prophet ﷺ asked or commanded to write something for him. We have a problem in identifying the numbers and the names because most of the traditional books mention scribes, just all scribes. Most of the traditional texts do not make, sub-lists of, these are scribes of agreements, these are scribes of political or peace agreements, these are scribes of charity registers, these are scribes of whatever other things, and these are scribes of Quran. They just lump all of them together because these are different genres. The Prophet ﷺ, for example, in Medina, he had Sahaba to write the revenues of the state, meaning the revenues of sadaqah, the revenues of zakah, revenues of even war and the spoils. They were revenues for that. He had a register for the army. There is a chapter in Bukhari, Babu man uktutiba, meaning that a chapter for those who were enlisted in the army, and he had the Sahaba who would write these names down. He developed census for people he said, that count for me the number of Muslims who are in Medina, and he once asked the number of the born Muslims in Medina. So they had a lot of different writing genres in Medina. That was all in his life. We know anecdotally that Umar ibn Khattab formalized these things, but they actually started prototypes of that. Started during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Sadaqat were written down, agreements were written down, the letters and correspondence with other people were written down. Of course, Quran is one of them. Some ahkam were written down. Sahaba would come and say, can I write this down from you? So that he has to write that down. He wants to give a khutbah in the Hajj. And then one person came, can I write this khutbah down? Like I liked it and I want to keep track. Said yes. And he asked somebody to write it for him. A lot of different genres. So most classical sources put a large list of scribes together. Some modern scholars try to say, can we navigate through these lists and just identify who was more known to write Quran? Very difficult, very exhausting process. What I would say is across many different books and writings on this topic, the most common number is in 40s. There are at least 40-something scribes who were primarily known to write the Quran. There were other things too, but that was like one of their main tasks with the Prophet ﷺ. And then the writing is started in Mecca. That's a debatable point. Some people believe that, some Muslim scholars too, believe that Quran was not written in Mecca. It wasn't really conducive environment to write in Mecca. Well, we have multiple accounts of Quran written in Mecca. We have people who came from Medina in the bay'at, in the pledges of Aqaba. One of them is Sayyiduna Rafi'. His name is Rafi' ibn Malik. After he became Muslim, the narration says he took with him like almost a camel load of written Quran of a lot of surah. Another version says he took Surah Yousef and Maryam written down. So you have stories like that. There are a lot of debates about their context, but Quran was written down in Mecca, at least to some degree. Yes, it was a difficult environment. It wasn't very easy, of course, to produce writing, but we have a lot of evidence that supports this idea. But the more structured writing of the Quran, of course, happened in Medina. These are among the most famous names who wrote Quran in Mecca. And again, tabaqat works, biographical works, work in the way that I'm going to identify criteria. Early Muslim, lived in Mecca. We have evidence that he wrote down for the Prophet ﷺ. Then we can infer most likely he wrote some Quran. So they apply these three criteria. They have multiple names. These are 4 famous names. Khalid ibn al-As, for example, was very famously known, the first person to write Basmala ever in Islam. And these people were very early Muslims. We have some other evidence for each one of them in their biographies about them writing the Quran. And these are other names of Sahaba who likely wrote Quran in Mecca. We have a lot of evidence that, okay, it's very likely that they wrote down Quran. These names like Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman, and Ali ibn Abi Talib, and other companions. All of these Sahaba were literate and not educated, but literate and educated in that sense of writing down the Quran. Medina became, of course, more structured, more organized, more formal process. And already there is existing literacy with the Jews in Medina, for example, and other Arabs. There are accounts of saying the Prophet ﷺ came to Medina and there were 12 expert scribes already in the city, known that they write different things. The Prophet made a great initiative, literacy, call it post-Badr, literacy initiative after the Battle of Badr. He has captives for the first time ever. It's the first official battle. And now he's debating, like, what should we do with the captives? You can pay ransom and go back home. Some people couldn't afford paying a ransom to be released. So he made an agreement with the literate captives that if you teach 10 children of Medina how to read or write, I'll let you go. A lot of them did that. One very, very kind of surprising and interesting result of this, the most important scribe of the Quran ever. What's his name? He was the chief of the committees both times, Abu Bakr and Uthman. They didn't change him. Zayd ibn Thabit, the most important person. I mean, a lot of other Sahaba contributed, of course, but he was the closest one of the closest companions to be more accurate with the Prophet until he died, about the Quran specifically. The early scholars would call the qira'at Zayd. That's the official qira'ah. That's the way you recite the Quran. He was the Prophet's neighbor. He would say, I was on a standby, like all the time, like on call. He calls me, there's new revelation come. I have the ink ready, I have the pen, I have all the tools. I go and then I write ayah. We have stories of him editing the revelation as the revelation is being revealed, because Allah revealed an ayah, لا يستوي القاعدون من المؤمنين والمجاهدون. That initially there was without the word غير أولي الضرر, right? And then Abdullah ibn Maktoum, so he wrote it already. And then the blind companion said, Ya Rasulullah, we can't do jihad, like I'm blind. So Allah right away responded to Abdullah's plea and he said, added that, just clause, غير أولي الضرر, except for the people of disability. Zayd already wrote it down. And the Prophet told him, okay, now you need to append it and add the غير أولي الضرر, and he added it. This is how immediate the process was and how the proximity Zayd had with the Prophet ﷺ. The beautiful, really, subhanAllah, interesting result is Zayd learned that through the captives. Zayd learned writing. He was very young. He was a child at that time. He was a result of the initiative who became literally the most important scribe of the Quran ever. And scribe and hafiz and everything. Again, Abu Bakr chose him, and then Uthman again chose him to be the chief of the committee that collected the Quran. And then the Prophet allowed the Sahaba to write the hadith. That's a different discussion. And then that's also another list of names of Sahaba who wrote down. In the Medina period, you'll find overlap with the Meccan period, but there are new names that now have contributed to the writing of the Quran. I will probably conclude with this idea of the instant documentation. I just mentioned an example, but this is the one that Sayyidina Zayd ibn Thabit mentioned about غير أولي الضرر, the insertion that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed. And then you have another incident that he would say, we were with the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, كنا مع رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم نؤلف القرآن من الرقاع. Use the word ta'lif, which means arrangement. We were with the Prophet, and it's a plural, so it's a group work. We were with the Prophet ﷺ, not only compiling, arranging the Quran. Riqa' is a certain parchment material. And then Abdullah ibn Abbas, another version, he says, we would be around the Prophet as scribe, taking turns. One writes and then leaves, and then the other one alternate, and the other one writes and they leave. And then he used an interesting wording, حتى كتبوا المصحف. Like this one of the few reports that use the word mushaf in this context. Until we wrote the whole mushaf. He didn't mean the whole Quran. Quran was still in progress, but he said like it was active. It's active. It's a group work. There's verification and there's review process involved. Sometimes the Prophet ﷺ would ask Zayd to recite back to him what he wrote down. So if there was any mistake or if he missed something, he would correct it. The story of Abu Bakr and Uthman, that's another, of course, topic that's not part of our discussion. But they added more and more layers of verification for all of that. They didn't restart, but like they basically said, we're going to examine every fragment of the Quran that is written and bring two witnesses. That was the direction of the directive Abu Bakr gave and later Uthman. Every ayah you include in the Mus'haf, you get two witnesses for that. What does two witnesses mean? That's interesting because some people said you need two Sahaba to come and give official testimony of this Quran. Some scholars said no. He meant one Sahabi to testify and one piece of material evidence. شاهد من القراءة وشاهد من الكتابة. One Sahabi has to testify, yes, I've learned this from the Prophet directly, not from somebody else. And you need to get a fragment or a piece or an animal bone, whatever material that has this ayah written for every ayah, including the Quran. And by the way, and Zayd is hafiz, so Zayd already knows, but he didn't just use his knowledge. And if he didn't have witness for one ayah, he would wait. He's like, oh, I know what, I'm just going to add it. No, he had to wait for some ayat. I need to wait until find somebody. That happened in Surah At-Tawbah a couple of times, or once in another surah as well. He said, I'm going to wait because that's the process. We have to be consistent. Every single verse, even though the community knows it, people recite it in Taraweeh, people recite it in Salah, it doesn't matter. It's a process that we have to be very consistent in the way we apply it. Jazakallah khairan. I hope that gave enough background view about the story of the preservation of the Quran. Maybe in the future, inshallah, we can continue the discussion about what Sayyidina Abu Bakr did and then what Uthman ibn Affan radiallahu anhu did. And then I know a lot of people have also thoughts and questions about the qira'at and the variant readings of the Quran. Understanding the preservation helps Allah understand what does it mean, say, Warsh and Qalun and all these different qurra, where these differences came from. The examples of Rahma and Rahmat or Salah and Husna, that helps understand a lot of phenomena and how these words in the qira'at are pronounced and articulated as well. Jazakumullah khairan. I'm going to be around for questions. If you have questions, if some of you need to leave, please go ahead, inshallah. But if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer any questions, inshallah.
The story of Islam Umar as the evidence that Quran was written in
Yes. Inshallah, in the book, I have a lot of these reports. Yes, the story of Umar al-Khattab when he encountered his sister and he attacked her and her husband. There was a sheet of the Quran that had. There are different narrations, the famous one, Surah Taha, and other reported Surah Takwir. So yes, that's evidence. Some people debated that story, by the way, but it's one of the evidence. It's one of the proofs. Yes. That was divine based. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there is something called al-ard al-akhira. Ard al-akhira means literally the final review. Right before the Prophet ﷺ died, every Ramadan, Jibreel reviews the Quran with the Prophet ﷺ. The last year, he reviewed it entirely twice. And that was the arda, or the review, in which Jibreel was telling him, this is where the final order of the Quran needs to be. So that's a divine based. Is there meaning for that? For sure. There's a whole ilm of munasabat, correlations, that they would investigate the sequence of these ayat. Ali ibn Abi Talib, radiallahu anh, he wrote down his personal copy of the Quran in the order of revelation, not in the order of the Mus'haf. And that's what some scholars use that as like a way of reflecting on the sequence of the Quran. It's not wrong, it's not the official order, of course, but that's something that some of the Sahaba did in reflection. He agreed with the other order, of course, but that's just his style of his own personal Mus'haf. Yes.
There has been a debate before about the story of the Jew, Sahar al-Nabi. You spoke later about the ayah that is animal or the arada.
Okay.
So when you're talking about that, the Prophet might forget. So some Al-Maniyin was using this evidence that هو سحر مرة and the Quran something was taken from him مرة. So
but same thing. Yeah. So same thing. It has already been conveyed, written down in circulation. So if one piece of writing was destroyed, it doesn't mean anything. The Sahaba wrote a lot, by the way. These are official writing. The Sahaba wrote for themselves. There are books on Masahif al-Sahaba. Sahaba had personal copies of the Quran. People wrote a lot for themselves. No, I think that's a different story. That's for Nasakh. That's a different story about the abrogation. That's different. But the idea of like this story about like a fragment or a piece of writing that was destroyed, even without knowing the story, that could have happened. That's doesn't affect the preservation in any way. Yes. Sure. Yep. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But it appears way back in the Quran. So when did the organization of the ayats happen?
Yes.
Yeah. Number two, the second question, what was the contribution of Hajjaj ibn Yousef?
Okay, Jazakallah khairan. So the first question, I think, similar to the question the sister asked earlier, that the arrangement of verses in the final shape happened towards the end of the life of the Prophet ﷺ. So there's something, the hadith that says every year Jibreel ﷺ كان يدارسه القرآن. Every Ramadan he recites the Quran with the Prophet ﷺ. Arguably all the revelation that has been revealed up to that Ramadan. The last Ramadan happened twice for the entirety of the Quran. Now we can trace the seerah and say, okay, if there were a couple months left before he died, ﷺ, then maybe some more Quran was revealed, but most of the Quran has been revealed up to that moment. And then he asked him, we have hadith in which the Prophet said, Jibril came to me and said, place this verse there. So the final arrangement happened, it's divine based of the verses, happened through Jibril ﷺ in the final, we call it al-ard al-akhira, the final review. One reason I was talking about Zayd ibn Thabit, he's very important because scholars said he was the closest, one of the closest companions to the Prophet ﷺ during that time of the last review. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud too, other companions, he wasn't the only one, but he's very famously known for that, and that's why they gave precedence to his opinion on the arrangement of the Quran. Of course, he was the head of the committee. For Al-Hajjaj, I think the sister mentioned him earlier. So Al-Hajjaj introduced more kind of systematic dotting and diacritics. Now you have a lot of copies of the Quran, a lot of formal copies. Now they're introducing colors, introducing dotting, and something important, he is credited with the division. So Al-Hajjaj asked scholars to count the letters of the Quran, not just the words, and then to divide the Quran based on the number of letters, not words. That's why people who memorize with arba' and athman, sometimes like, why is the ruba' here? Like, why is this quarter is not as much, not the pages. The pages now we do with the pages, but like a lot of, like the way I memorize, for example, we do arba'. Arba' are not equal in size, right? It was based on the number of letters, not thematic, not meaning. It was just like to make it easy for people to memorize sometimes, and also to make it the portions for the qira'ah in the masajid. He had a few, Nasr ibn Asim and Abu al-Aswad, and a few grammarians and scholars. He asked them to do that division. The idea of hizb, ushr, and ruba', all of that started with Al-Hajjaj. Scholars accepted it, aside from Al-Hajjaj kind of personality. They accepted it, and it became one of the most common ways of dividing the Quran. Sure. Of the what? The variations of the variant readings? Yes, so yeah, that's inshallah a whole other seminar on this. Inshallah, I'm planning to do one on qira'at and how they came into kind of in that form. But the short answer will be, the Prophet ﷺ, he asked Allah, he said that in the multiple hadiths. He asked Allah that, I actually had this hadith in one of the slides that I skipped. He asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through Jibreel that some of my ummah, I have children, he literally said that, have children, have old people who cannot read in one particular way. So he asked Allah for takhfif, for kind of to make it easy. So Jibreel told him, إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَأْمُرُكَ أَن تُقْرِأَ أُمَّتَكَ عَلَى سَبْعَةِ أَحْرُفٍ. That's the whole idea of harf or ahruf. Allah is commanding you to basically permit your ummah, your community, to recite in 7 ahruf. There's a lot of debate about what ahruf means. The general idea is in different ways. So he started allowing people to pronounce in their own dialect. So why do we do imala? Why do you say, some people say husna, some people say husni? These are Arabic dialects. So the Prophet ﷺ told Jibreel, if I have a 60-year-old convert, and all of his life he says huda, I can't force him to say huda. He can't. It's going to be very difficult. And I don't want to put any barriers for the recitation of the Quran. The meaning is not going to change. These are just articulation points. So I just want to make things easier for them. Some people, it's difficult to pronounce Hamza, right? You have some qira'at do ibdal, do a lot of things. They just go around the Hamza in a lot of ways. You have scholars say al-ard. It's easier than al-ard for some people, just like it's easier dialectically. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave that permission in Medina. That happened late, by the way. It wasn't initially. He said, yeah, people can read these ways. It wasn't open permission for everybody to say whatever they want or to recite whatever way. But now he's receiving people reciting to him, and he's saying, okay, that's valid. That's valid. That happened in the famous story when Umar al-Khattab heard Hisham, or another Sahabi, reciting in the masjid. He was praying. He was reciting Surah Al-Furqan. And that's Umar al-Khattab. Like he knows the Quran. He said, I heard him reciting in a way that I've never heard before. He said that he was almost about to jump him. It's like he really wanted to interrupt his salah. He got very angry. He said, like, but I controlled myself. I waited until he finished. And then I grabbed him from his collar. It's like, okay, who taught you to recite like this? He said, this is how the Prophet taught me. He said, no, because I've learned the same surah from him. So he took him and said, like, we need to go and ask him. That was during his life, alayhi salatu wasalam. So the Prophet did something beautiful. He said, Hisham, read the same way you read in your salah. He recited. He said, هَكَذَا نَزَلَتْ. It was revealed like this. And he asked Umar, read. And he said, he recited different way. He said, هَكَذَا نَزَلَتْ. It was recited this way. You know what is interesting? He didn't say you're correct, you're correct. He said it was revealed this way for both instances, even though they were recited differently. Not a major difference, not a different surah. It's like generally the same content. But he said both are divine, both are from Allah. Allah has permitted us to recite in these different ways. And another interesting thing about this hadith is that Umar said, this person, he was very mad at him. He didn't want to say Hisham. He said, this person has recited in a way that is different from how you taught me. Like he is telling us that it's teaching. That's why scholars said al-qira'atu sunnatun muttaba'a. Qira'ah is sunnah. Sunnah here means the way you're taught. اقرأوا كما علمتم. The way you recite, the way you taught, the way you have to recite. So it was a permission. The general answer is it's a permission to recite in different ways. A lot of these differences do not have impact on the meaning. Their articulation points of hamza, of mad, of imala, of all these kind of phenomena of how to articulate certain letters, just to make the recitation of the Quran easier for people. It's a different dialect, yes, different dialect. Yeah. And by the way, some scholars counted all the qira'at differences, speaking of quantitative studies, and they said the number of difference, I think they said the total number could be about 400. And then they said, and it's really in words, not just in mad and that will be like thousands, but like just the actual word, about 400. They said the number of words that have slight impact on the meaning is 90. 90 compared to how many words in the Quran, 6,000 something, like ratio-wise, that's nothing. These are words that they're not even contradictory. They're just adding another meaning. Malik, Malik, both are correct. They can be simultaneously correct, but one means the sovereign of the Day of Judgment, one's mean the owner, like the king, or it depends how you translate it. But like they both are correct. We know that Allah is both, subhanahu wa ta'ala. So only 90 is an extremely small number, and none of these 90 differences actually has like a meaning that is entirely contradictory. They're all very harmonious. It's not just different redactions or different phrasing. The idea of harmony is the strongest kind of answer to this question. If you're looking for I know that wasn't brief, but if you're looking for a brief answer, yes. Alaykum salam wa rahmatullah.
But can you talk a little bit about the controversy between April 9 and love, and what kind of arguments the other side has?
But this is not related to the history of the Quran. It's not related to the provision of the text, because the debate doesn't apply to that. That debate is theological debate about the kalamullah. So this is the reflection of the sifa, the attribute of speech of Allah, because we say Quran kalamullah. Quran is the speech of Allah, right? Quran is in words and language, but that reflects the internal, the inherent attribute of speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The idea of meaning and wording here is related to how to conceptually think of Allah speaks. But no one debated that about, or that debate didn't affect that these are the exact words that the Prophet ﷺ delivered by the command of Allah. The debate is theological in the way how to perceive the idea of Allah speaks. Does Allah recite the Quran this way? That's the controversy you're referencing. Does Allah recite in these words and letters? That's the point, because He's different from human beings, right? He can't be just speaking like human beings. But at the same time, He gave us the Quran. It's a theological conception. It doesn't affect at all that. The text of the Mus'haf that we have is the same that He gave to the Prophet ﷺ. If you're interested in the theological point, we can talk on the side. But for our topic, it doesn't affect it at all. It affects maybe the point of translation, how to translate the Quran. The scholar said, is it allowed? The ikhtilaf about, can I recite Quran in the Salah in different language? Early scholars, Hanafi scholars, thought about people who are from Persia who wanted to read Fatiha in Persian. Maybe the idea of ma'na and love, meaning and wording, was invoked for that. But it's not relevant to, we have the text preserved. I'm trying to think of what the other relevant points. Yes. Alayhi salatu wasalam. Mm-hmm. It means two things. One, he wasn't proficient in reading or writing, alayhi salatu wasalam. And two, he was from people that this is the first time they received revelation from Allah. No, it has. So the first one is he wasn't proficient in writing. He didn't really know writing at a deeper level or reading. If possibly he knew, it was very basic. Yeah. Okay, Jazakumullah khairan. Sure. I don't know if that can be done in few sentences, because linguistic miracle needs somebody who can appreciate the language. Numerical consistency could be an argument, but it's not a core argument. But the idea of linguistic, so people say, I don't speak Arabic, why the Quran is miraculous to me? right? Like, don't tell me it's miraculous because it's Arabic. That's true in a way, that if you want to know the linguistic miracle, you need to appreciate the language. So you need to study rhetoric and really appreciate that in the same language of the text, right? It's like you asking why Shakespeare is special. I need to know English, that English, to deal and treat and appreciate the language. So that's why the answer to that is you can do a historical fact. It was a challenge. As I mentioned multiple times today, these people, instead of challenging the Quran, they literally like lost lives instead of just like sitting down and writing something. Eventually he told them, like, you know what, you can gather all of you together and do collective work. It doesn't have to be one-on-one. Initially it was one-on-one, by the way. The tahaddi, the challenge, was one-on-one. And then he said, bring jinn too. Like, if you can really like draw from jinn or whatever, you can bring all of you together and write down or produce something like it. They couldn't. So it's a historical fact that no one was able to produce something like the Quran. You can use a historical argument that is very well verified, because yeah, not everybody will be able to appreciate the deep eloquence of the text. People should try to reflect on that, obviously, but that's why it could be historical, it could be rhetorical. Okay, جزاكم الله خيرا. Again, thank you, Sheikhna. Allah يبارك فيكم. جزاكم الله خيرا كثيرا.
جزاكم الله خير, everyone. جزاكم الله خير. Allah bless you.
يبارك فيك.
MashaAllah, I like the engagement. You guys really paid
نبدأ
attention.
معك.
الله يحميك. جزاكم الله عنا كل خير. Thank you.
الله يبارك فيكم يا رب. وإياكم. جزاكم الله خير. آمين.